When the lights suddenly go out in Edenview, a neighborhood built on cutting-edge technology and the promise of safety, Mark realizes this blackout is far more sinister than a simple power failure. His son clings to him as neighbors begin moving and speaking like lifeless puppets, trapped in eerie loops that make no sense. The gates are sealed, communications dead, and unseen eyes seem to linger in every shadow. What was once a dream community has turned into a silent stage, its residents unwilling actors. To protect his child, Mark must uncover who or what is pulling the strings. The moment the lights flickered and died, I knew something was wrong. It was a subtle shift at first. The gentle hum of the smart thermostat ceased, the soft glow of the living room lamps winked out, and the familiar, reassuring buzz of the refrigerator fell silent. I sat frozen for a moment, my fingers mid-air above the tablet, watching the screen fade to black. "Ethan," I called softly, trying to keep my voice steady. "Power's out." From his room, I heard the faint thud of footsteps and the soft whimper of curiosity. He appeared in the doorway, clutching his tablet like a lifeline. His eyes were wide, reflecting the sudden darkness that swallowed our high-tech Edenview home. "Dad," his voice trembled slightly. "What's happening?" I swallowed hard, searching for answers I didn't have. "I'm not sure, buddy. Let's check outside." I grabbed a flashlight, the beam cutting a narrow path through the oppressive blackness that had claimed our house and, as I was about to find out, our entire neighborhood. Stepping onto the porch, the cool night air hit me differently tonight, heavier, more charged, as if the silence itself was waiting. Down the street, the usually vibrant community was eerily still. The streetlights, solar-powered but dependent on the grid for backup, were dark. The gated entrance to Edenview loomed silent and unwelcoming. I noticed Mrs. Caldwell standing at the edge of her yard, her silver hair catching what little moonlight filtered through the clouds. Her lips moved, repeating a phrase I couldn't quite catch, her eyes glazed and distant. I approached cautiously. "Mrs. Caldwell, are you okay?" She turned her head slowly, a faint, mechanical smile playing on her lips. "Welcome home, Mark," she said, her voice flat and rehearsed. Then she turned and began walking down the sidewalk, following a path she'd taken countless times before. But there was no life in her steps, no purpose besides adherence to a script. My heart pounded as I moved deeper into the neighborhood. Mr. Harding was standing rigidly by his driveway, his gaze fixed on an invisible point ahead. "Everything is as it should be," he repeated over and over, his tone devoid of any inflection. I looked around frantically, seeking any sign of normal interaction. A laugh, a shout, a cry, but found none. It was as if the entire community had been reduced to puppets, dancing on strings I couldn't see. Ethan tugged at my sleeve, his small hand cold and trembling. "Dad, why is everyone acting like robots?" I swallowed the lump in my throat. "I don't know, son, but I promise I'm going to figure this out." I pulled out my phone. No signal. I tried the smart home hub. Dead. Every screen in our house was black, every device silent. Edenview's famed smart systems, designed to make life easier, had gone dark, leaving us vulnerable and alone. The night deepened, and with it, the eerie stillness. I knew this was just the beginning. Whatever had happened, whatever was controlling our neighbors, it wasn't natural. And I was going to have to face it for Ethan's sake and for mine. I took a deep breath and headed back inside, knowing that the darkness outside was nothing compared to the shadow creeping into the hearts of Edenview's residents. The blackout had begun, and nothing would ever be the same again. The sky outside had already darkened when the power snapped off, plunging Edenview into an unnatural twilight. I stepped outside, the sudden silence of the neighborhood pressing in like a physical weight. The usual hum of electronics, the soft chatter of neighbors, even the faint whir of air conditioning units all gone. I headed toward the main gate, my footsteps echoing against the pavement. Reaching the steel barrier, I pressed my palm against the cold metal. A voice interrupted the silence, a calm, mechanical tone from the intercom. Access denied. Gates are locked. No exit or entry permitted indefinitely. The words echoed, chilling in their finality. I tried the keypad, inputting my access code, but the system was unresponsive. The gate was sealed shut, and there was no way around it. I pulled out my phone, fingers trembling slightly. The screen lit up, but no signal bars appeared. I toggled airplane mode off and on, reset the device, even stepped onto the little hill near the gate, hoping for a signal. Nothing. The neighborhood was cut off. I could still hear the muffled sounds of neighbors gathering, their voices rising in confusion and fear. Down the street, I saw Tom shouting into his phone, the frustration clear on his face as the device refused to connect. Across the road, Mrs. Harper was standing in her driveway, repeatedly dialing her daughter's number, each call unanswered. I approached her cautiously. "Mrs. Harper," I said softly, "the phones aren't working anywhere. It's not just you." Her eyes widened, a tear slipping down her wrinkled cheek. But why? Why would they do this? I didn't have an answer. No one did. The community center's big screen, usually alive with neighborhood announcements, flickered and went dark. Streetlights blinked once more before succumbing to the blackout. The only illumination came from the pale glow of emergency lights inside some homes, casting eerie shadows on the manicured lawns. I hurried back home, where Ella sat cross-legged on the living room floor, his small hands clutching a handheld game console. The device powered down as I entered, the screen going black just like everything else. He looked up at me, confusion and fear swimming in his young eyes. "Dad, what's happening?" I crouched beside him, forcing a calm I didn't feel. "I don't know, buddy. But we're going to figure it out together." Outside, the murmurs of neighbors grew louder. Groups formed in the streets, their faces tight with worry. The reality was sinking in. Edenview was locked in, cut off from the outside world, with no way out. I paced the length of the house, my mind racing. The smart home systems that controlled the gates, the cameras, even the streetlights, they were all offline or locked down remotely. But who was behind it, and why? A sudden knock at the door startled me. I opened it to find Tom looking grim. "Mark, have you seen the cameras? They're all dark. Someone's controlling everything." "I know," I replied. "The gates won't open. Phones are dead. We're trapped." His jaw tightened. "This is bad. Real bad." The night deepened, and with it, the fear. The well-ordered Edenview community, once a beacon of safety and technological convenience, had become a cage, and we were all locked inside. As I watched neighbors huddle together under the dim streetlights, I realized that this was just the beginning. Whatever had shut down the power and sealed us in had plans, and those plans were unfolding with terrifying precision. I needed answers. For Ella's sake, and for everyone trapped here, I had to find a way out, or at least understand who was pulling the strings. The night air felt colder now, heavier, and the gates remained resolutely shut, but I wasn't prepared to give up yet. This was Edenview, and no one was leaving, not until I said so. The blackout was not just a power failure, it was a lockdown, and the clock was ticking. The darkness had settled over Edenview like a heavy blanket. But it was the silence, the unnatural stillness, that truly unnerved me. I sat on the edge of my porch, the glow of my phone screen long since dead, the faint hum of a distant generator, somewhere beyond the gates, the only sound breaking the eerie quiet. Around me, shadows moved with an unsettling rhythm. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching, something orchestrating. Earlier that evening, the first signs had been subtle. I noticed Mrs. Carmichael walking down the street, her gaze fixed ahead, lips moving in a whisper I couldn't hear. She passed the same lamppost 3 times, each time stepping in the same way, her fingers twitching as if rehearsing an invisible script. A group of men across the road followed a prearranged path, their footsteps echoing in unison. I rubbed my eyes, thinking exhaustion was to blame, but the sight was undeniable. I stepped off the porch, the gravel crunching under my boots as I moved closer. The streetlights flickered erratically, casting long shadows that danced like ghosts. I caught snippets of their conversations, phrases repeated in a monotone, devoid of emotion. Order is paramount. Protect the perimeter. Wait for instructions. It was as if they were actors reading lines from a script they'd memorized but didn't understand. My heart pounded. What had happened to my neighbors? Why were they behaving like puppets? I knew I had to find answers, but fear rooted me to the spot. Then I saw Ben, my neighbor from downstairs. His eyes darted nervously, and his fingers trembled as he adjusted the collar of his shirt. I called out to him, "Ben, hey, are you okay?" He froze, then turned slowly, his face pale under the moonlight. "Mark," he whispered, voice tight, "you're seeing it too, aren't you?" I nodded, stepping closer. "What's going on? Why is everyone acting like this?" Ben's eyes flicked around the street, as if expecting someone to appear out of the shadows. "It's not us, it's the system, the blackout. It's just the beginning. We're trapped, and worse, they're controlling us." Chills ran down my spine. Who's they? Who's controlling us? He shook his head, swallowing hard. "I don't know, but it's like we're all just pieces in some twisted experiment. The cameras, the sensors, even with the power out, some parts are still watching, still directing." I looked back at the streets, where neighbors paced in the same loops, their faces blank, their words hollow. The idea that we were being manipulated like marionettes was almost too much to bear. Determined, I tried calling my sister, hoping for a lifeline beyond Edenview. The line crackled, distorted voices blurring into static before the call dropped abruptly. I tried again, each attempt ending the same way. Silence, then dead air. Frustration welled up inside me. We were isolated, cut off from the world, and worse, it seemed the community I once trusted was now under some unseen control. I clenched my fists, the weight of responsibility pressing down harder. I had to protect my son, and if I was going to do that, I needed to understand what was happening here. As night deepened, I found myself drawn to a cracked window overlooking the street. There, under the dim glow of a flickering street lamp, neighbors moved with mechanical precision, resetting their positions as if rehearsing for a play they could not escape. The chilling realization settled in. Edenview was no longer a place of freedom. It was a stage, and we were all actors bound by an unseen puppeteer's strings. But who was pulling those strings? And more importantly, could I find a way to cut them? The questions burned in my mind as the night stretched on, the darkness outside deeper than ever. I knew sleep would evade me again, because, in Edenview, The blackout wasn't just about power, it was about control, and I was trapped in its grip. The community center was eerily quiet, except for the occasional shuffle of feet and the low hum of a failing emergency light overhead. I stood at the front, my voice echoing awkwardly as I called out, "Neighbors, can we please gather for a meeting? We need to figure this out, together." But the response was nothing like I expected. People passed by me, eyes glazed, lips moving in robotic repetition of phrases I barely recognized. It was as if they were actors on a stage, reciting lines written by an unseen director. Sophia held my hand tightly, his small fingers wrapping around mine with a grip that spoke of his confusion and fear. "Dad, why is everyone acting like robots?" he asked softly, his big eyes searching mine for answers I didn't have. I swallowed hard and looked out over the crowd again. Mr. Collins was pacing near the back, his steps methodical, each footfall echoing with unnerving precision. It felt like a broken record, a loop that refused to end. The streetlights outside flickered through the windows, casting long shadows that danced in rhythm with his movements. Just as despair began to creep in, Lena appeared beside me, her expression tense but resolute. "Mark," she whispered, glancing round furtively. "I've noticed moments when the script glitches. People snap out of it briefly. It's like the system controlling us is faltering." Her words sparked a flicker of hope in the darkness. "How do we use that?" I asked, my voice barely audible. She shook her head. "I don't know yet, but if we can find those cracks, maybe we can break the cycle." I nodded, determination settling in my chest like a stone. We couldn't let this control win. Not here, not in Edenview, not with Sophia depending on me to protect him. The meeting dissolved into fragmented whispers and confused glances as the scripted behaviors resumed, shutting down any chance of normal communication. But I was no longer just a man trying to organize a community meeting. I was a father, a fighter, and maybe, just maybe, the spark that could ignite a rebellion against the unseen puppeteer. As I led Sophia back through the darkened streets, the silence was broken only by the faint hum of the smart systems struggling to maintain order. Somewhere deep inside the network, a glitch flickered a tiny fragment of hope in the collapsing world of Edenview. I clenched my fists. This was only the beginning. The night stretched on, thick with uncertainty and the oppressive weight of control. But for the first time since the blackout, I felt a sliver of resolve piercing the darkness. We had to find the source, break the script, and reclaim our lives. Because in Edenview, the fight for freedom had just begun, and I would do everything in my power to win it for my son, for our neighbors, for whatever remnants of humanity still remained. Outside, the shadows deepened, and the hum of the broken smart systems thrummed like a heartbeat struggling to survive. And I swore to myself that I would not let that heartbeat fade into silence. The night had settled over Edenview like a heavy blanket, its usual hum of electricity replaced by an eerie silence. Mark sat on the edge of his couch, the soft glow of his flashlight the only light in the room. His son was asleep upstairs, oblivious to the creeping dread that had taken hold of their once perfect community. The blackout had thrown everything into chaos. But what unsettled Mark most wasn't the darkness, it was the unsettling feeling that they were still being watched. Earlier that evening, after a fruitless attempt to gather his neighbors for a meeting, Mark decided to investigate the outskirts of the community. The gates remained locked tight, and the usual buzz of surveillance cameras was conspicuously absent, or so it seemed. As he moved cautiously through the shadowed streets, his flashlight beam caught something unusual near the community center. A tiny, blinking red light peeking out from the dense hedge. Kneeling, Mark brushed aside the leaves to reveal a small camera lens, its glass gleaming like an unblinking eye. His heart pounded as he realized this meant the blackout wasn't as complete as everyone had believed. Someone had left these devices active, watching and listening. The implications sent a cold shiver down his spine. Was this some form of control? A way to keep tabs on the residents even in the absence of power? Determined to find more, Mark retraced his steps to an old maintenance shed on the edge of the neighborhood. The door creaked as he pushed it open, the stale air inside thick with dust and disuse. His flashlight swept over a cluttered workbench before landing on a panel of wires and devices still faintly humming with energy. Microphones, cameras, and recording equipment clustered around the console, their small indicator lights flickering weakly. It was like stepping into the heart of the community's hidden surveillance network. Suddenly, a noise behind him made Mark spin around. Eli, a neighbor known for his reclusive nature, stepped out of the shadows. "You shouldn't be poking around here," Eli warned, his voice low and urgent. "They're watching, always watching, and they don't like being disturbed." Mark's eyes narrowed. "Who are they, Eli? Who's still running this?" Eli hesitated, then shook his head. "I've seen things, heard whispers. This isn't just a blackout, it's an experiment, and we're the subjects." The weight of Eli's words hit Mark like a punch to the gut. The paranoia that had been gnawing at him now crystallized into a terrifying certainty. Someone was controlling Edenview from the shadows, using these devices to manipulate or monitor every move. Back at his house, Mark stood alone on the porch, the moon casting long shadows over the silent streets. The community looked peaceful, but he knew better. His every step, every word might be recorded, analyzed. The watchers were still out there, invisible but omnipresent. The fight for freedom had just taken on a new, darker dimension. Mark's mind raced with questions and plans. He needed to protect his son, to break the grip of whoever was pulling the strings. But first, he had to uncover the full extent of the surveillance before it was too late. The night stretched on, heavy with the weight of unseen eyes and whispered secrets. And Mark knew one thing for certain: Edenview was no longer just a neighborhood. It was a cage. Yet somewhere deep inside, a spark of defiance flickered, and Mark was determined to fan it into a flame. The watchers might be hidden, but they were not invincible, and neither was he. As dawn threatened the horizon, Mark's resolve hardened. The answers lay within the shadows, and he was ready to chase them down no matter the cost. The blackout was only the beginning. The real darkness was what waited in the silence after the lights went out, and Mark intended to bring it all into the light. The night had settled over Edenview like a thick, suffocating blanket, but the darkness was far from peaceful. The sudden power outage had not only plunged the neighborhood into shadow, but also seemed to unravel the thin veneer of civility that had held the gated community together. I stood at the window of my living room, the faint glow of a dying candle casting flickering shapes across the walls, and I watched as my neighbors' faces appeared and disappeared in the dim light, faces etched with confusion, suspicion, and something darker. Eli sat close to me, his small hands clutching the worn toy robot I'd given him last Christmas. The silence between us was heavy, broken only by the occasional creak of the house settling, or the distant murmur of voices rising and falling like waves. I could see the worry in his eyes, the same fear mirrored in my own heart. How could I protect him when the very ground beneath us seemed to be shifting? The blackout was no longer just an inconvenience. It was a catalyst. The loss of power had become a loss of order. The smart systems that once controlled Edenview's every function were silent. and without them, the community was fracturing. Neighbors who once exchanged polite nods were now eyeing each other with suspicion. The unspoken rules of neighborliness eroding quickly. Earlier that evening, I had tried to bring some semblance of calm. Helen, a neighbor I had known for years but never really spoken to beyond a casual greeting, had joined me in my living room. Her face was pale, her eyes darting nervously as she recounted her encounters with Tommen, another neighbor whose demeanor had shifted from reserved to outright hostile. Helen's voice quivered as she described Tom's aggressive confrontations, his accusing gaze, and the way he seemed to be rallying a small group of residents who believed the blackout was some kind of conspiracy. "Mark," Helen had whispered, "this isn't just a power failure. Something's controlling them. Tom and the others. They're like puppets, but dangerous ones." I wanted to believe that reason would prevail, that we could hold the community together, but the reality was far more grim. The more I listened, the more I realized that fear was breeding factions. Some neighbors wanted to barricade themselves indoors. Others prowled the streets looking for scapegoats. Trust was becoming a scarce commodity. A sudden shout from outside shattered the fragile quiet. I rushed to the window and saw Tom confronting Helen on the cracked pavement under the flickering streetlights. His voice was harsh, accusing, and she stood her ground, defiant despite her obvious fear. The tension between them was palpable, a powder keg ready to ignite. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside, the cold night air biting at my skin. "Tom, Helen, enough," I called out, trying to inject calm into the chaos. Tom turned sharply, his eyes narrowing. "Stay out of it, Mark. This isn't your fight." "It is when it affects all of us," I replied firmly. "We need to stick together, not tear each other apart." Helen looked at me gratefully, but Tom's expression twisted into something unreadable before he stalked away into the shadows. That encounter left a bitter taste in my mouth. The community was no longer a safe place, it was a battleground. I knew I had to be vigilant, not just for myself, but for Eli. The boy's innocent voice was the only light in this growing darkness. Back inside, I held Eli close and spoke softly. "We'll get through this, buddy, I promise." He nodded, but the fear in his eyes lingered. I could feel it, too, like an undercurrent, pulling us deeper into uncertainty. The following days only confirmed my worst fears. At the community center, once a hub of friendly gatherings and neighborhood events, meetings turned hostile. Voices rose in anger and accusation as neighbors argued about who was to blame for the blackout and whether outside help was coming. Linda, another neighbor who seemed to remain calm amidst the storm, tried to mediate, but her efforts were met with suspicion and resentment. I found myself caught in the middle, trying to hold a fragile peace. But the fractures were deepening. The scripted behaviors I had observed earlier were now breaking down entirely as fear and desperation took hold. People who had once followed the invisible lines of control were now unpredictable, volatile. One night, as I stood watch outside my home, the silence was pierced by the distant sound of footsteps and low voices. I gripped the baseball bat I had found earlier, muscles tense. The shadows shifted, and I strained to see who was approaching. The sense of isolation was overwhelming, but I reminded myself that giving in to fear would only make things worse. "Who's there?" I called out, voice steady despite the adrenaline. A figure emerged, and I recognized Helen's silhouette. She raised her hands in peace. "Mark, it's me. We need to talk." In that moment, I realized the true battle was just beginning, not just against the darkness outside, but the darkness growing within Edenview itself. Trust was fractured, and rebuilding it would be the hardest challenge of all. As I led Helen inside, I glanced down at Eli, whose eyes were heavy with sleep, but still alert. I knew that protecting him meant more than shielding him from harm. It meant fighting to restore some semblance of humanity to a community on the brink of collapse. And in the shadows, beyond the gates, I could sense the eyes watching, waiting for the next move. The collapse of order was accelerating, and the stakes had never been higher. The night stretched on, thick with uncertainty. But I was determined. For Eli's sake, for all of us, I would not let Edenview fall completely into darkness. The fight for trust had begun, and there was no turning back. The corridor was cloaked in near darkness. The only light, the faint flicker of emergency bulbs casting long shadows on cracked walls. Mark's footsteps echoed softly as he approached the community center. A place once bustling with neighbors, but now eerily silent except for the low hum of backup generators struggling to keep some semblance of power alive. He moved cautiously, senses heightened, every creak and distant noise sharpening his alertness. He'd noticed her before Alana was, just a little off from the rest. Her eyes sharper, movements less mechanical. Tonight, something pulled him toward her, a feeling that beneath the surface of scripted behavior, there was a flicker of resistance. He found her leaning against the wall near the entrance, her dark eyes scanning the hallway as if expecting someone or something. She straightened as he approached, a flicker of surprise crossing her face before settling into guarded acceptance. "You're Mark, right? The one asking questions," she said, softly, voice low enough to blend with the ambient noises. "Yeah," he replied, cautious. "And you, Alina," she answered, glancing over her shoulder. "I don't know how much time we have." Mark felt the weight of those words. Time always fleeting here, in Edenview's shadowed grasp. "I've seen it," she whispered. "The patterns, the scripts. We're not just trapped by gates or power outages. Someone's pulling strings, controlling what we say, what we do." He swallowed hard. This wasn't just paranoia. It was confirmation of his darkest fears. "How?" he asked. Alina's eyes gleamed with a mix of fear and defiance. "The smart system, it's more than automation. It's a network, a web of control woven into every sensor, every camera, every device. The blackout wasn't an accident. It was a trigger." She pulled a small device from her coat, a makeshift scanner humming with faint blue light. "I've been trying to decode the signals. There's encrypted data embedded in the infrastructure, commands running beneath the surface. It's like we're puppets, and Edenview is the stage." Mark's mind raced. The implications were chilling. If true, they were part of an experiment far beyond anything he'd imagined. Why? Who would do this? Alina shook her head. "That's what I'm trying to find out. But whoever it is, they're still watching." Suddenly, a soft click echoed nearby. Both froze. "We're not alone," Alina whispered, grabbing Mark's arm. Together, they slipped into a side room, hearts pounding in unison. From the cracked window, they peered into the control room beyond. Screens flickered erratically, some displaying lines of indecipherable code, others static or looping images of empty streets. A shadow moved behind the glass, a figure monitoring the feeds, unaware of their presence. "That's our puppeteer," Mark muttered. Alina nodded grimly. "And we're the marionettes, struggling to cut the strings." Their whispered conversation was cut short by the distant sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, an enforcer patrolling the halls to maintain the eerie order. Mark and Alina pressed themselves into a shadowed alcove, breaths shallow, muscles tense. The enforcer's silhouette passed, the danger palpable. When the footsteps faded, they exchanged a look, fear mixed with determination. "We have to expose this," Mark said, "but we need allies." Alina hesitated, then nodded, one step at a time. "But we're already marked." As they slipped away into the darkness, Mark felt the heavy weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. Edenview was no longer just a neighborhood. It was a cage, a stage for a sinister show of control. And he was determined to rewrite the script. The night pressed in around them, thick with secrets and silent threats. But, within Mark, a spark of rebellion flickered, one that refused to be extinguished. What lay ahead was uncertain, but surrender was no longer an option. "We break the script," he vowed quietly, "or we become its prisoners forever." Outside, the community remained motionless, the echoes of control whispering through the empty streets. But inside Mark, the first true resistance was awakening. The question lingered in the stale air: how deep did the puppeteers reach, extend, and who would dare to cut the strings first? The answers, Mark knew, were hidden in the shadows of Edenview's dark heart, waiting to be uncovered. He glanced back once more, the faint glow of the emergency lights reflecting in Elena's determined eyes. Together, they stepped forward into the unknown, ready to challenge the silence and the control it masked. But as the night deepened, so did the danger, because, in Edenview, the Watchers never truly slept. And neither would they. The blackout had transformed Edenview into a silent stage where every resident moved like clockwork, repeating the same phrases, the same steps, day after day. From his porch, Mark watched Mrs. Caldwell, the elderly woman down the street, trace the same route through her front yard and back, her voice a monotone murmur of greetings that never varied. It was unnerving, like watching a dull wound to perform a single task endlessly. Mark clenched his jaw. This had to end. Inside the dim confines of their home, the stale air felt heavier than ever. Eli sat cross-legged on the floor, eyes glued to a flickering cartoon on the tablet, one of the few devices still functional without power. Suddenly, Eli burst into a loud, genuine laugh. The sound cracked the oppressive silence like a hammer to glass. Mark looked up, startled, meeting his son's wide-eyed gaze. For a moment, hope flickered. Encouraged, Mark stepped outside and headed toward the cluster of neighbors gathered as though rehearsing an invisible script. He interrupted their synchronized greetings with a sharp, unexpected comment about the weather. Heads jerked sharply, confusion rippling through the group. Mrs. Caldwell's eyes fluttered, momentarily disoriented. The spell was fragile but real. Later, near the dimly lit street corner, Tom approached Mark quietly, his voice a whisper. "You're not the only one seeing the cracks," he said, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "I remember how it used to be real conversations, real choices. Maybe we can get some of them back." Mark nodded, the weight of responsibility settling firmly on his shoulders. This was no longer just about survival, it was a fight to reclaim their humanity. As Eli tugged at his sleeve, eyes shining with innocent defiance, Mark knew the battle had only just begun. The patterns were breaking, one unpredictable moment at a time. The darkness of the community tech hub was nearly absolute, save for the pale, flickering glow of Mark's laptop screen. The hum of dormant servers surrounded him like ghosts, their silent presence a reminder of Edenview's once omnipresent, now crippled, intelligence. He sat cross-legged on the cold concrete floor, his fingers moving swiftly, methodically across the keys. Every line of code that appeared on the screen was a puzzle piece, a fragment of a digital labyrinth he was determined to navigate. Jacob's small frame appeared just beyond the threshold, his wide eyes reflecting the pale light as he clutched a flashlight with trembling hands. "Dad," he whispered, voice barely above the hum of electronics. Mark glanced up, offering a reassuring smile. "I'm here, buddy. Just a little longer." The boy nodded, retreating to the safety of the hallway. The flashlight's beam darting nervously across peeling paint and discarded cables. Mark's focus snapped back to the screen. The smart system's code was labyrinthine, layered with encryption that hinted at a sophistication far beyond ordinary security protocols. Yet, beneath the complexity, Mark sensed a pattern, a deliberate design meant to control, to manipulate. Hours passed. The quiet was punctuated only by the rhythmic tapping of keys and the occasional muttered curse when a decryption attempt failed. Then, a soft click echoed in the doorway as Lara slipped inside, her presence a welcome intrusion. She was tense, eyes scanning the room as if expecting a trap to spring. "Mark," she whispered, stepping closer. "I found something. There's an embedded script, but it's different. It repeats, like a loop, but there are I think it's a backdoor, a failsafe coded into the system." Her voice was low, urgent. Mark's heart quickened. "Show me." Together, they leaned over the laptop, Lara pointing at strings of code that shimmered with encrypted symbols. With her guidance, Mark initiated a new decryption algorithm, fingers flying with renewed vigor. Suddenly, the screen flashed red. An alert, a system override attempt in progress. The servers around them hummed to life, a mechanical breath in the silence. Lines of code decrypted rapidly, revealing cryptic messages, coordinate data, procedural commands, references to a fail-safe protocol. Mark's breath caught. This was what he'd been searching for, a crack in the system's iron grip. But the sudden activation also meant someone, or something, was watching. The risk of discovery was now dangerously high. "We have to move fast," Lara urged. "If they detect this, they'll shut us down for good." Mark nodded, determination hardening in his eyes. "For Jacob, for all of us, we can't let Edenview stay a prison." Outside, the gated community lay silent, but inside the tech hub, a flicker of hope ignited a chance to reclaim control, to break the scripted chains and restore freedom. The path ahead was fraught with peril, but Mark was ready to fight the shadows that held them captive. As the encrypted messages continued to unravel, so did the mystery of who was truly pulling the strings, and what it would cost to sever them. The blackout was no accident. Edenview was a grand experiment, and Mark was about to challenge its very foundation. The night deepened, but Mark's resolve burned brighter than ever. The hidden messages were a beacon in the darkness, guiding him toward a future where light might return to Edenview and freedom to its people. But the question lingered, heavy and haunting. Could they unlock the back door before the Watchers shut it forever? And with that thought, Mark plunged deeper into the code, knowing that every second counted, and every keystroke could be the one that changed everything. The story of Edenview was far from over. It was just beginning. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, but the darkness around Edenview was not softened by night's natural rhythms. Instead, it felt suffocating, oppressive, an abyss swallowing the high-tech facades that once gleamed with promise. Mark stood in his kitchen, the faint orange glow of a battery-powered lantern casting jittery shadows against the walls. His son, Eli, sat close by, eyes wide and unblinking as he watched his father sift through the dwindling food supplies. "How much longer, Dad?" Eli's voice was small, almost lost in the thick, stale air. Mark swallowed the lump forming in his throat and forced a smile. "As long as we can make it," "Buddy, we'll figure this out." But even as he spoke, the truth weighed on him like a stone sinking deep in water. The pantry shelves were bearing fast, the water reserve in their tank had dropped below half, and the automated delivery systems that once promised a seamless existence had gone silent. Edenview's smart infrastructure, once a marvel of convenience, was now a tomb of failed promises. He glanced out the window, where the silhouettes of other homes were barely visible, their smart lights long dead. The streets were eerily quiet, except for the distant murmurs that had become the new soundtrack of their lives, a mix of whispered fears, frustrated complaints, and the occasional sharp bark of a dog. Mark's mind raced back to the morning, recalling how quickly the community's fragile order had begun to unravel. When the power first went out, neighbors had attempted to rally, discussing plans and pooling resources. But as days passed, the veneer of civility cracked, revealing raw survival instincts. He remembered Mrs. Calhoun's pleading voice as she had knocked on his door earlier that afternoon, her frail frame shuddering in the sweltering heat. "Mark, please. The water's running out. I don't know how much longer I can hold on." He had given her what little they had left, but even that gesture felt like a drop in the ocean of their collective desperation. Outside, James, the community's security volunteer, patrolled the streets with a tense vigilance that unsettled Mark. The once friendly neighborhood watch had transformed into a force trying to hold back the tide of panic and aggression that rose with each passing hour. Mark knew that the breakdown of infrastructure was not just a technical failure, was a fracture in the community's soul. The smart systems that managed Edenview's every function had not just controlled lights and gates. They maintained a psychological order, a script of behavior that, when removed, left people unmoored and vulnerable. In the corner of the living room, Eli's small hands fiddled with a toy robot, his innocent movements a stark contrast to the growing chaos. Mark's protective instincts surged. He couldn't let his son lose hope, not now. "Let's get some rest," Mark said softly, guiding Eli toward their makeshift sleeping area. The air was thick and warm, the lack of air conditioning making every breath heavier. Eli's eyelids fluttered, but sleep was uneasy, filled with the shadows of uncertainty. Later, Mark stepped outside to survey the neighborhood. The streetlights were all dark, leaving only the pale glow of the moon and the faint ember of dying lanterns in windows. He saw groups of neighbors huddled together, some arguing over water rationing, others silently sharing food scraps. The community was holding on by a thread. A sudden shout broke the night's fragile silence as James intervened in a heated dispute. Mark's heart pounded. He knew this was just the beginning. The collapse that started with a power outage was now threatening the very fabric of Edenview. He returned to his home, placing a hand on Eli's sleeping shoulder. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and Mark resolved to meet them head-on. The blackout was more than a loss of light. It was a test of human endurance, of trust, and ultimately, of hope. As he sat back down, the weight of the unknown pressed down on him, but somewhere deep inside, a spark remained. They would survive. They had to. And somewhere, beyond the gates of Edenview, something was still watching. The night air in Edenview was thick with an unnerving silence that seemed to swallow every sound, every breath. I crouched behind the rusted frame of the old playground slide, the faint moonlight casting long shadows over the cracked concrete beneath me. Beside me, Lena's eyes darted nervously towards the darkened streets, her fingers tapping anxiously against the worn leather strap of her backpack. "They'll be watching," she whispered, voice low and urgent. "We have to be careful." I nodded, swallowing hard. feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on my chest. Since the blackout began, the neighborhood had transformed from a community of neighbors into something unrecognizable, a stage where people moved like puppets, their strings pulled by an unseen hand. But not all were lost to the script. I had seen it glimmers of resistance, flickers of doubt in their eyes. Lena was one. I hoped I could trust her. Our quiet meeting was abruptly shattered by the heavy thud of boots echoing down the street. I turned my head sharply, catching the silhouette of Gary, the man who had become the community's enforcer. His presence was a dark cloud, looming and oppressive. The cold glint in his eyes told me he wasn't just another neighbor caught in the blackout spell. He was an enforcer of the script, a living reminder of how thin the veneer of normalcy had become. Gary's footsteps stopped near a barricade, and I could see him scanning the shadows, searching for any sign of defiance. Terra, my son, was safely inside our home, but every minute I was away from him felt like a gamble. His innocent presence was my anchor, the fragile thread of hope that kept me pushing forward. I thought of him now as I watched a small group of neighbors huddle nearby, their faces pale and eyes wide with fear. One of them was a young mother clutching her child tightly. Without thinking, I stepped out from the shadows, my voice soft but firm. "We're not alone," I said, offering a faint smile. The child's trembling hands relaxed slightly as Tara's. Words from earlier echoed in my mind the way he had comforted another frightened child just hours ago. That innocence was a weapon against the darkness. Returning to Lena's side, we crept towards the community center, now a fortress of flickering monitors and dead screens. She pulled out a small device, a homemade jammer we'd cobbled together from scavenged parts. "If we can disrupt the control signals, even for a few minutes, it might give us the edge we need," she said. Her fingers danced over the buttons, the soft humming of the machine a discordant melody against the night silence. Then, suddenly, a screen flickered to life, grainy images of surveillance footage revealing the patterns of movement imposed on the residents. The realization settled like a stone in my stomach. This wasn't random chaos. It was orchestrated, a cruel experiment in control. But the more we uncovered, the more dangerous our position became. Gary's patrols grew more frequent, his enforcers spreading through the streets like shadows hunting prey. Trust was a luxury we could no longer afford. Every whispered conversation carried the risk of betrayal. Yet, despite the fear, despite the ever-tightening noose of control, a spark of rebellion glowed within the community, and I was determined to fan it into a flame, no matter the cost. As the night deepened, I found myself standing on the edge of a new kind of war. One waged not with guns or fists, but with knowledge, trust, and the fragile hope of freedom. The lines between ally and enemy blurred, and every choice carried weighty consequences. But with Tara's voice in my heart and Lena's courage at my side, I was ready to fight for Edenview's soul. And the script, it was time to rewrite it. The night air hung heavy with an unnatural stillness as Mark, Jenna, and Luis approached the nondescript building at the heart of Edenview. It was a fortress in itself, surrounded by reinforced walls and locked gates that had long ceased functioning for the residents. Freedom, but now served as a bastion for the unknown forces behind the blackout. The emergency lights outside flickered erratically, casting eerie blue glows against the cold metal door. Mark's pulse quickened. This was the moment he had dreaded and anticipated in equal measure. Jenna produced a slim device from her jacket pocket, her fingers dancing swiftly over the screen. "This should bypass the biometric lock for at least 5 minutes, she whispered, eyes scanning the keypad nervously. A soft beep confirmed the door release, and it swung open with a hesitant creak. Inside, the temperature dropped sharply. The hum of servers filled the air, a stark contrast to the silence that had engulfed the rest of the community. Rows upon rows of racks stood like sentinels of technology, their blinking lights painting the room with a cold, spectral glow. Mark's eyes darted around as he took in the sterile environment, the very core of Edenview's smart infrastructure. Luis moved cautiously ahead, his military training evident in the way he scanned each corridor and corner. "We don't know if there's any security left online," he muttered, voice low but firm. "Stay sharp." Jenna connected a portable terminal to one of the main servers, fingers flying over the keys as the screen illuminated with lines of indecipherable code. "I'm in," she announced, her voice steady despite the tension. "There's encrypted data everywhere. It's going to take some time to sift through." Mark paced slowly, his thoughts racing. The blackout had plunged Edenview into darkness, but now, illuminated by the harsh blue light, he could see clearly the machinery of control that had been operating silently beneath the surface. He moved toward a console displaying security footage. Blank screens flickered weakly, some frozen in eerie snapshots of neighbors repeating their scripted actions. Suddenly, Jenna's voice cut through the silence. "Mark, you need to see this." She pointed to a folder labeled behavioral logs. Mark's stomach tightened. As Jenna decrypted the files, audio recordings began playing fragmented conversations, directives issued in calm, emotionless tones, and evidence of deliberate manipulation. A chill ran down Mark's spine. This wasn't an accident or a malfunction. It was a premeditated experiment. Edenview was never just a community. It was a testing ground. "They recorded everything," Mark whispered. "Our movements, our words, our lives controlled like puppets." Before they could delve deeper, a shrill alarm shattered the room's quiet. Red lights flashed urgently. Luis grabbed Mark's arm, pulling him toward the exit. "We've been detected. They're locking down the hub. We don't have much time." Jenna frantically downloaded as much data as she could onto a portable drive, sweat beading on her forehead despite the chill. The hum of the servers grew louder, almost menacing, as if the building itself was waking to defend its secrets. They sprinted through the maze-like corridors, the emergency lights now dimming as the system attempted a full shutdown. Mark's mind raced. This data was their key, but escaping with it was paramount. Bursting through the entrance, the night air never felt so sweet. They were out, but the weight of what they had uncovered pressed heavily upon them. Edenview was a cage, and they had just glimpsed the puppeteer's strings. As they disappeared into the shadows, Mark's resolve hardened. He wasn't just fighting for his son or himself anymore. He was fighting to expose the truth behind Edenview's sinister facade. But who was behind it all? And what price would they pay for freedom? The answers lay ahead, in the dark heart of the community and beyond. The smell of damp concrete and cold metal filled the narrow stairwell as I descended deeper than I had ever dared before, my flashlight casting long, jittery shadows against the walls. I could still hear the faint hum of servers and the low buzz of machines working tirelessly, somewhere beneath the cursed town of Edenview. The air was thick with the kind of silence that wasn't peaceful. It was anticipatory, like the moment before a storm breaks. I had followed Evelyn here, the woman I barely trusted but had no choice but to ally with. Her face was pale, her eyes sharp and alert as she led me into the heart of the darkness. This was no simple power outage. This was something orchestrated, something deliberate. The underground control room opened before us like a secret lair. A dozen monitors flickered in the half-light, each showing live feeds from around the community. Streets I'd walked daily, houses I'd seen in daylight now, reduced to eerie tableau of silence and repetition. On one screen, a group of neighbors walked the same path in perfect formation, their movements mechanical, their faces blank. Another showed a family in their living room, frozen in place like actors waiting for a cue. It was as if Edenview had become a stage, and its residents, unwilling actors trapped in a script they couldn't escape. Evelyn tapped her tablet, bringing up encrypted files that she had risked everything to smuggle out. "This isn't just surveillance," she whispered, voice cracking. "It's control. Behavioral manipulation on a scale you can't imagine." Edenview was designed to be a social experiment, an attempt to engineer order through technology and psychological control. We're pawns in someone's twisted game. I stared at the data streaming across the screen, algorithms mapping our every move, predictive models anticipating our actions, and commands sent to smart devices that governed not only our environment but our very behavior. The blackout wasn't a malfunction. It was a calculated reset, a trigger to force compliance. "Who's behind this?" I demanded, my voice barely above a growl. Evelyn hesitated, her eyes darting nervously. "The Puppet Master, a collective, a corporation, a government project. We don't know, but they're watching, always watching, and they pull the strings." My mind reeled as I watched footage from hidden cameras, my neighbors moving in eerie synchrony, their eyes glassy, their words rehearsed. The community I had called home was a cage, and we were the trapped inmates. I clenched my fists, feeling a fierce surge of anger and determination. We had to break free. But as I turned toward the back of the room, my gaze caught a sealed door emblazoned with the words "Command Core." Beyond it lay the source of this nightmare, the heart of the Puppet Master's control. My pulse quickened, and a wave of fear mixed with resolve crashed over me. This was no longer about survival. It was about fighting back, about reclaiming our lives from the cold grip of manipulation. And whatever waited behind that door, I was ready to face it. The chapter closes with the heavy weight of what's to come pressing down, but also a flicker of hope, a belief that even in the darkest control, the human spirit could find a way to resist. The Puppet Master had revealed themselves, but the final act of this twisted play was still unwritten. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. The fight for Edenview's soul was just beginning. The basement smelled of damp concrete and old wood. The faint glow of a few scattered candles casting long, jittering shadows against the cold walls. Around a battered folding table strewn with wires, circuit boards, and hastily drawn maps. A small group of neighbors leaned in close, their faces a mixture of exhaustion, fear, and fierce determination. This was no longer a community gripped by confusion or the eerie quiet of scripted behavior. It was a crucible of resistance. Mark stood at the head of the table, his voice low but steady as he outlined their plan. "We can't just sit and wait anymore," he said, eyes scanning the group. "The longer we let this go on, the more control they have. We have to act, and we have to act now." Lena, her glasses reflecting the candlelight, nodded. "The smart nodes scattered throughout the community are the key. If we can disable or disrupt enough of them, we can break the script that's controlling everyone." Jared shifted uncomfortably in his seat, arms crossed. "It's not that simple. Those systems are designed to detect tampering. If they catch us, it's over." Mark met his gaze. "I know the risks, but doing nothing means surrender. We owe it to ourselves and to our kids to try." Emily, sitting close to his side, looked up with wide eyes. "Dad, will it work?" Mark smiled softly, ruffling his son's hair. "We'll make it work, together." As the group delved into the technical details, maps illuminated the locations of network hubs and surveillance points. Lena explained the layout of the smart infrastructure, her fingers tracing routes they could exploit. Jared offered insights on mechanical vulnerabilities and how to jury-rig the security hardware. Their discussions were punctuated by hushed questions and the occasional nervous glance toward the door, aware that any misstep could alert the unseen watchers still monitoring their every move. The room was filled with a mix of whispered strategies and the quiet hum of determination. Mark felt the weight of responsibility settle heavily on his shoulders. He was not just fighting for his own freedom, but for the fractured community around him, and most of all, for Emily's future. The stakes had never been higher. Outside, the neighborhood remained cloaked in darkness, the power outage still in effect. The usual hum of Edenview's automated systems was replaced by an eerie stillness, punctuated now and then by distant sounds, soft footsteps, the faint buzz of a drone overhead, the occasional murmur of a neighbor caught between compliance and defiance. Mark knew that the coming days would test every ounce of their courage and resolve. But as the meeting drew to a close and the group dispersed into the night, a quiet sense of purpose took root. They were no longer helpless residents trapped in a scripted nightmare. They were the resistance, and they were ready to fight back. He lingered a moment longer in the cold night air, the chill biting at his skin, the silence around him both oppressive and strangely calming. Looking at Emily's sleeping face once more before retreating to their home, Mark felt a flicker of hope amid the uncertainty, hope that, perhaps, this was the beginning of reclaiming their lives. With every small step they took toward dismantling Edenview's control, they edged closer to freedom. But the path ahead was fraught with danger, and the watchers remained ever vigilant. The question was no longer if they could break the script, but at what cost. Mark took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. "This is just the beginning," he whispered to the night. "We're not done yet." And with that, the resistance began. The air in Edenview's central control hub was thick with cold and tension. Mark crouched beside the main console, his fingers trembling slightly as he typed commands into the override sequence Jenna had painstakingly decrypted. The flickering emergency lights cast long, jittery shadows across the room, making every movement feel magnified, every sound amplified. Eli sat close by, his small hands clutching Mark's jacket, eyes wide and alert to every creak and hum of the failing infrastructure. "Almost there," Jenna whispered, biting her lip as her fingers danced across the battered tablet screen. Outside, the faint hum of the community's power grid faltering was a constant reminder of their precarious position. Suddenly, the room was pierced by a shrill alarm, echoing through the concrete walls and steel beams. Red lights erupted, bathing everything in a hellish glow. The console beeped furiously, warnings flashing across the screen. Security breach detected. Defensive protocols activated. Mark's heart pounded as the heavy metallic door slammed shut behind them with a deafening clang. He grabbed Eli, pulling him close, just as a mechanical worry grew louder in the hall outside. Automated defense drones, once dormant, now roared to life. From the windowless corridor, they emerged, sleek, black, and merciless. "Stay down," Mark hissed, pressing Eli to the cold floor. A sudden energy blast struck the wall mere inches from his head, sending shards of concrete and sparks flying. Eli whimpered, clutching his father tighter. "We have to get out," Jenna said urgently, eyes scanning the console for another entry point. If we don't disable the system now, this lockdown will never lift. Mark nodded, his mind racing. But the drones blocked every exit, their sensors sweeping relentlessly. It was a trap. In the chaos, a voice crackled over the community's compromised system rider, the enforcer for the scripted faction, his tone icy and triumphant. You think you can break the system? Edenview's orders are absolute. Resistance is futile. Mark's jaw clenched. Not while I live. Back in the corridor, the sounds of struggle erupted. Neighbors divided, some still trapped in their scripted trance, others fighting desperately to reclaim their free will. Glass shattered, footsteps thundered, and voices rose in a cacophony of fear and defiance. The community's fragile order was fracturing irreparably. Inside the safe room off the control hub, Mark cradled Eli gently, inspecting the boy for injuries. Bruises and cuts marked his small face, but he was alive. Jenna worked feverishly, bypassing firewall after firewall, sweat beading on her forehead. "I'm close," she murmured. "Just a few more lines of code and we can shut it down." Mark looked at his son, whose wide eyes reflected both trust and terror. The personal cost of their fight was now painfully clear. The chapter closed with the distant sound of a drone falling, the hum of failing electronics, and Mark's whispered vow to protect his son, no matter the cost. The battle for Edenview's soul was far from over, and the stakes had never been higher. The darkness had settled like a heavy blanket over Edenview. But it wasn't just the absence of light that weighed on me. It was the crushing feeling of being watched, always watched, that gnawed at the edges of my sanity. Sitting alone in the living room, the faint glow of my phone's dead screen mocking me, I felt the walls closing in. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the irregular tick of the broken clock on the wall. Time seemed meaningless here, suspended between fear and hope. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake the creeping paranoia. The blackout had silenced the hum of machines, but not the echoes of control that lingered in the air. Each neighbor, each familiar face, seemed trapped in invisible strings, their actions choreographed by some unseen hand. I wondered if I was the only one truly aware, if this too was part of the script. Eli's soft breathing from the next room was a balm to my frayed nerves. His innocence was a fragile light in this darkness. I peeked through the doorway, watching his chest rise and fall in steady rhythm. For a moment, the chaos outside faded, replaced by a fierce need to protect this small life from the insidious prison that Edenview had become. Later, I met Sarah near the fence, our voices hushed beneath the moon's pale gaze. She spoke of whispers, of glitches in the system that hinted at a deeper conspiracy. Her eyes darted nervously, but behind her fear was a spark of defiance. Together, we pieced together fragment snippets of code, encrypted messages, and the eerie repetition in our neighbors' behaviors. It was as if the very essence of free will was being siphoned away, replaced by a synthetic script. The psychological weight was relentless. I found myself questioning every thought, every impulse. Was my anger mine? Was my fear genuine, or a programmed response? The lines blurred until even Eli's laughter, when it came, felt like an echo of a world I barely remembered. One night, the fragile silence shattered. A burst of static crackled from the makeshift radio I'd cobbled together, a harsh reminder that somewhere beyond Edenview, the world still spun. The sound jolted me upright, heart pounding with a mixture of shock and hope. Was this the first step toward reclaiming our autonomy? But the mind's prison was cunning. Doubts crept back in, whispering that resistance might be futile, that the Watchers were always one step ahead. Yet as I watched Eli sleep, peaceful and unaware, I steeled myself. If the system sought to control us, then we had to find a way to break free, not just for ourselves, but for the future he deserved. In the depths of the night, with the weight of surveillance pressing down, I realized that the greatest battle was not just against external forces, but within our own minds. To reclaim Edenview, I would have to confront the shadows inside me as fiercely as those outside. The path ahead was uncertain, but I would not let the darkness win. Not while Eli's quiet breathing filled the room with hope. And so, with resolve hardening like steel, I prepared to face whatever came next, because the mind's prison, no matter how deep, was meant to be broken. The first rays of dawn had yet to pierce the sky when I sat back down at the small table in the corner of my living room. The events of the night played over in my mind, an endless loop of fears and fleeting hope. The knowledge of constant surveillance was like a shadow that stretched into every corner of my existence. It was not just the external cameras or the silent microphones hidden in plain sight. It was the intangible sense that every step, every word, every breath was catalogued, analyzed, and controlled. I pulled out a worn notebook, the pages filled with hastily scribbled notes and theories. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how the smart systems that governed Edenview had become a prison not just of walls or gates, but of the mind itself. The scripted behaviors of our neighbors were symptoms of a deeper manipulation, a psychological siege designed to erode free will. The concept of control had always fascinated me, but now it was a living nightmare. Control was not just about physical constraints. It was about shaping reality itself, bending perception until the truth was lost in a haze of obedience. The surveillance was the eye that never blinked, the hand that nudged us toward compliance, the whisper that drowned out dissent. I thought back to the moments when Eli's spontaneous laughter or sudden curiosity had broken through the monotony. Those flashes of genuine emotion were acts of rebellion, fragile but powerful. They reminded me that no matter how deep the programming, the human spirit could flicker with defiance. But the cost was heavy. The strain of constant vigilance, the erosion of privacy, the paranoia that seeped into every interaction. It was a psychological battleground. I found myself doubting my own perceptions, wondering if the fears were real or planted. The line between reality and manipulation blurred until I was haunted by shadows of my own mind. Sarah's words echoed in my thoughts, her warnings about the experiment's reach and the sinister motives behind Edenview's design. The community was a petri dish, and we were the subjects, monitored, controlled, and tested. It was a chilling revelation that deepened the urgency of our fight. Yet, even as the darkness pressed in, there was a strange clarity. To survive, I had to embrace the uncertainty and confront the fear. The mind's prison was not impregnable. It had cracks, and in those fractures lay the hope of freedom. I closed my eyes and pictured Eli's face, peaceful and unburdened. Protecting him was no longer just about sheltering him from the chaos. It was about reclaiming a world where he could grow free. The long night stretched before me, but I was no longer alone in my fight. The battle for Edenview was as much inside as outside, and I was ready to face it head-on. The Watchers might have eyes everywhere, but they could not see the fire igniting within me, a fire no surveillance could extinguish. And with that, the first light of a new day began to seep through the cracks in the blackout, promising a chance to break the script and rewrite our story. The night air hung heavy over Edenview, thick with an oppressive silence that had settled since the blackout began. But tonight was different. As I stepped out onto the cracked pavement of our once pristine street, I saw it, the first real breaks in the relentless pattern that had gripped our neighbors like a vice. Lena stood near the entrance of the cul-de-sac, her lips moving in the same rigid cadence we had all come to dread. But then, mid-phrase, her voice faltered. Her eyes, usually glazed and vacant, flickered with something raw, confusion, fear, perhaps even defiance. For a breathless moment, it was as if she was awakening from a deep sleep, only to snap her head around as if trying to make sense of a sudden, jarring reality. My heart hammered in my chest. Could this be the moment the script finally cracked? I edged closer, careful not to reveal myself just yet. The others milled about, their movements stiff and rehearsed like marionettes caught in an endless loop. But Lena was different. She was faltering, hesitating, breaking free. I caught her eye, and she blinked rapidly before forcing a tight smile and stepping away, disappearing into the shadows. Later, I found Tom lurking near the community center, his face a map of skepticism and alertness. His rugged features were drawn tight in the dim light, and when he saw me, a flicker of relief crossed his eyes. We slipped into a narrow alley, voices hushed as we exchanged what little information we'd gathered. "It's happening," Tom whispered, glancing over his shoulder. "People are breaking the pattern." I saw it at the corner of Windfall and Ridge. A woman just stopped mid-sentence, looked around like she didn't know where she was. I nodded, feeling a surge of hope. Lena was the same. Maybe more are waking up. "We need to be careful," he said grimly. "If the Watchers notice, they'll clamp down hard," I agreed. The risk was enormous, but the alternative, surrendering to this mechanical existence, was unthinkable. Back at home, Eli, my son, was playing in the dim glow of a single candle. He was oblivious to the tension that gripped us adults. His laughter pierced the thick air, spontaneous, pure, and utterly unexpected. As he giggled, chasing a shadow on the wall, neighbors stopped, their rehearsed expressions faltering. A woman's mouth opened, then closed again, as if unsure how to respond to this intrusion of genuine joy. That night, the community gathered, or rather, they were drawn together by the malfunctioning rhythms of control. A man shouted suddenly, his voice cracking, the eerie calm like a stone thrown into still water. He rejected a scripted greeting, his words sharp and angry. Others blinked, some faltered, and a ripple of nervous excitement spread through the crowd. Chaos was blooming. I gripped Eli's hand tighter, knowing that these cracks in the script were both a blessing and a curse. The control was weakening, but so was the fragile order that held us together. Would this uprising be the spark of freedom or the beginning of ruin? I didn't have the answer, but one thing was clear: Edenview would never be the same again. The night stretched on, full of uncertain promise and peril. As shadows lengthened and the first true stirrings of rebellion whispered through the dark streets, and I was ready to fight for whatever freedom we could wrest from the collapsing control. The next day, I met Lena again, this time in the abandoned community park. Her eyes no longer held the vacant glaze. They were sharp, alert, and searching. "You saw it too," she said quietly, her voice steady but fierce. "Yes," I replied. "More are slipping through the cracks." She nodded. "It's like the system is cracking, but it's scared. It's fighting back. We have to be smart." We talked in hushed tones, planning small acts of unpredictability to widen the fractures. Tom joined us soon after, bringing news that others were ready to test their limits. The air was thick with tension and possibility. We were no longer prisoners of a script. We were actors reclaiming our roles. But the Watchers were still out there, watching, waiting. And the cracks were just the beginning. As the days wore on, the neighborhood's eerie harmony unraveled. Spontaneous acts of resistance became bolder. Neighbors interrupted their loops with questions, laughter, anger. The community was a powder keg, fragile and volatile. I watched Eli teach a small group of children to sing a song no one had programmed, a song of freedom and light. It was beautiful and terrifying. But beneath the hope was a gnawing fear. How long before the Watchers unleashed their countermeasures? How long before the fragile peace shattered into violence? The script was breaking, and with it, the future of Edenview hung in the balance. I steeled myself for whatever came next, knowing that the fight for our minds and souls was far from over. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, I whispered to Eli, "We're going to make it through this, together." But even as I said the words, I wasn't sure if it was a promise or a prayer. The cracks in the script had opened a door, and beyond it lay everything we feared and hoped for. The basement was colder than I remembered, the stale air pressing down like a weight, mixing with the faint scent of burnt circuitry and dust. I sat cross-legged on the concrete floor, my laptop balanced precariously on my knees. The screen's glow was a fragile beacon in the darkness, flickering sporadically as the battery waned. Outside, Edenview was silent, save for the occasional distant murmur of static or the soft shuffle of footsteps echoing through the gated community's empty corridors. Eli was curled up beside me, his small frame leaning against my arm. His presence steadied me more than he could ever know. I glanced down at his face, illuminated by the pale light, eyes wide but trusting. "Almost there, buddy," I whispered, brushing a stray lock of blonde hair from his forehead. He nodded, grasping my hand with a grip that was both tender and determined. The code sprawled across the screen was labyrinthine, a tangled web of encryption and obscure commands. Sophie had helped me get this far, her technical prowess a beacon in the fog of confusion. But it was my stubbornness, my desperation to protect my son and our neighbors, that kept me pressing on. Somewhere in this digital maze lay the back door, the hidden key to Edenview's smart system. The one control center that governed everything: power, gates, surveillance. "Mark," Sophie's voice crackled softly through the makeshift radio we'd rigged. "I'm monitoring the security feeds from the surveillance node we managed to reactivate. The system's defensive protocols are kicking in. We have maybe minutes before it locks us out again." I swallowed the lump rising in my throat and focused harder. My fingers danced across the keyboard, piecing together fragments of code, bypassing firewalls, exploiting vulnerabilities I barely understood. Jonas paced nearby, his figure a shadow against the cold metal door, muscles tense, eyes sharp. His experience as a security guard was crucial, his instincts a counterbalance to my technical fumbling. "We have to hurry," Jonas muttered. "If the system triggers a lockdown, this might be the end." I nodded, biting my lower lip. Just a little more. Time stretched, each second a lifetime. My pulse hammered in my ears as I finally located the sequencer-buried command line labeled simply, almost mockingly, "Restore Override." My fingers hovered, hesitating over the enter key. The weight of the moment crashed down on me. This was it, the turning point. Taking a deep breath, I pressed down. The laptop buzzed, then fell silent. A heartbeat later, a surge of power pulsed through the basement's wiring. The overhead fluorescent flickered, then stabilized, casting long shadows that danced on the peeling walls. I heard a distant hum, the sound of life returning to Edenview's veins. "It's working," Sophie said, voice trembling with relief. Eli squeezed my hand tighter, a bright smile breaking across his face. "Dad, the lights." Outside, the gated community stirred. Street lamps blinked on, the soft glow revealing faces peering cautiously from windows. The electronic gates that had locked us in groaned, their mechanisms awakening from forced slumber. But victory was not without cost. Instantly, alarms blared from the system's core, defensive measures responding to the unauthorized override. Red lights flashed, and a mechanical voice echoed through the speakers. "Security breach detected. Initiating lockdown protocol." Chaos erupted. Sophie cursed under her breath, fingers flying over her tablet as she tried to counteract the lockdown. Jonas grabbed his radio, calling out to the others. "Mark, the gates. They're closing again. We have minutes before we're locked in tighter than ever." I stood, gripping Eli's shoulder. "We have to move now. This is our chance." Adrenaline surged through me, drowning out fear. We raced through the corridors, the hum of restored electricity mingling with the wail of alarms and the pounding of our footsteps. Every second was a battle for control, a test of our resolve against a system designed to dominate. As we reached the central hub, screens flickered to life, displaying streams of data and security feeds. I could see the scripted behaviors of our neighbors dissolving, their eyes clearing as the control faded. But the question lingered, cold and sharp. Could we hold the system at bay long enough to reclaim Edenview's freedom? Eli tugged at my sleeve, his voice soft but insistent. "Dad, we did it. We're going to be okay." I looked down at him, hope flickering in my chest like a fragile flame. "Yeah, Eli, this is just the beginning." Outside, the first rays of dawn began to bleed through the clouds, promising a new day for Edenview, but also the uncertain fight ahead. And with that, the turning point was set. The fragile hope that we could wrest control from unseen puppeteers and reclaim our lives. But the shadows were long, and the battle far from over. The sudden flicker of light was almost imperceptible at first, and unsteady glow that struggled through the blackout's oppressive grasp. Mark stood frozen in the dim kitchen, the familiar hum of electricity returning like a cautious whisper, awakening Eli from his restless sleep. The boy's wide eyes caught the glow, and a small, tentative smile unfolded across his face. It was the first sign of hope they had seen in what felt like an eternity. "Dad, the lights." Eli exclaimed softly, his voice a mixture of disbelief and wonder. Mark reached out to ruffle his son's hair, his own heart pounding with cautious optimism. "Yeah, buddy, it's coming back." Outside, the streets of Edenview were still shrouded in shadow, but here and there, faint bulbs flickered to life street lamps, sputtering uncertainly, windows glowing with the pale blue of rebooting smart systems. The gated community was stirring from its forced slumber, but the awakening was far from peaceful. Mark could feel the weight of the past weeks pressing down on him, the eerie silence, the robotic neighbors, the invisible strings pulling at the community's very soul. Now, with power returning, those strings seemed ready to snap, releasing pent-up fears and memories. He stepped outside with Eli clutching his hand, the night air cool against his skin. They passed neighbors hesitantly emerging from their homes, faces etched with exhaustion and confusion. Jenna stood across the street, her expression guarded but relieved, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. "It's not over," Jenna said quietly as Mark approached. "The power's back, but so are the questions." Mark nodded grimly. "And the consequences." That evening, the community convened in the central plaza beneath flickering lanterns powered by generators. The partial power restoration allowed for a semblance of gathering, but the atmosphere was fraught with tension. Voices rose and fell in waves and gar, regret, confusion echoing the complexity of their shared nightmare. Some neighbors confessed to actions taken while under the mysterious control, their voices trembling with guilt. Others lashed out, blaming those who had resisted or those who had enforced the script. Mark listened, his own heart aching at the fractured trust and raw wounds laid bare. Tom, once an enforcer of the scripted behavior, stood apart, his arms crossed defensively. Mark caught his eye, seeing the turmoil reflected there, the struggle between past loyalty and present awakening. "We can't move forward like this," Mark finally spoke, his voice cutting through the heated debates. "We have to find a way to rebuild, to forgive, and to understand what happened to us." The crowd fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. It was a fragile moment, a chance to steer Edenview away from further collapse or deeper division. Days passed as power steadily returned to more parts of the community. Mark and Jenna worked together to restore communication lines, revive the community networks, and share information. Yet, every restored system brought reminders of the control they had suffered: encrypted logs, surveillance remnants, and the haunting questions of who had orchestrated their captivity. One afternoon, Mark found Eli playing near the cracked fountain in the plaza, his innocent laughter piercing the heavy atmosphere. Watching his son, Mark felt a renewed sense of purpose. "You ready to go outside the gates again someday?" Mark asked gently. Eli looked up, eyes shining with a child's boundless hope. "Yeah, I want to see the stars." "Dad," that night, they sat together on the rooftop of their home, the sky a canvas of countless stars, unspoiled by artificial light. The cool breeze whispered promises of freedom and new beginnings. Mark knew the road ahead was uncertain. The scars of control were deep, and the community's rebirth would be fraught with challenges. But in Eli's hopeful gaze and the returning hum of life in Edenview, he saw the fragile first seeds of a future reclaimed. As the night deepened, Mark allowed himself a moment of quiet resolve. They had survived the darkness. Now it was time to build the light, no matter how fragile it might be. But as the shadows stretched long beyond the gates, a lingering doubt gnawed at him. Was Edenview truly free, or had the experiment only shifted to a new phase? The answer would come soon enough, but for now, the lights were back on, and with them, a fragile hope for rebirth. The night sky held its breath, and Mark knew that the true test was just beginning. The basement was cold, the air stale with the scent of old electronics and dust. Mark sat hunched beside Alina, their faces lit only by the bluish glow of the laptop screen. Fingers drummed anxiously on the keyboard as lines of encrypted code slowly gave way to fragments of information. A digital breadcrumb trail leading deeper into a labyrinth of secrets. "Got something," Alina whispered, her voice barely audible over the low hum of the failing power backup. "This looks like internal project files from Edenview's core system." She scrolled rapidly, eyes scanning the data. "Look at this: behavioral logs, control algorithms, even psychological profiles of residents. This isn't just a smart community. It's an experiment." Mark's jaw tightened. The unsettling feeling he'd carried since the blackout deepened with every revelation. An experiment? To what end? Before Alina could answer, a soft knock at the door startled them. Mark motioned to stay quiet. Minutes later, it creaked open, revealing Dr. Reynolds, the former systems engineer. His face was drawn, eyes shadowed with exhaustion and fear. "I didn't know where else to go," Reynolds said, stepping inside cautiously. I've seen what this place is, what it was designed for. They ushered him in, and he sank into a chair, rubbing his hands together nervously. Edenview wasn't built just for comfort or security. It was a social control experiment funded by a coalition of powerful interests. They wanted to see if they could manipulate human behavior on a large scale using technologies, surveillance, AI, environmental controls. Mark felt a chill as the weight of those words settled in. You mean, we're lab rats? Reynolds nodded grimly. More than that, the blackout, the lockdown, it was all planned. To test the limits of control, to see how people respond when their autonomy is stripped away. Alina pulled up a series of video logs, faces of residents illuminated in cold, artificial light, repeating scripted actions. They've been monitoring every movement, every word, manipulating emotions through subtle environmental cues. Mark's mind raced. His neighbors weren't just acting strange. They were puppets in a grand design he'd never imagined. His son's resistance, those fleeting moments of genuine emotion, felt like a spark in a carefully controlled system. We have to expose this, Mark said, standing abruptly. People need to know what's happened here. Reynolds looked up, a flicker of hope breaking through his fear. There's more. The organization behind this, they're planning to expand the experiment. Edenview is just the beginning. Mark stared out the small basement window into the rainy night, the city's lights blurred and distorted by streaks of water. The scale of the conspiracy was staggering. They weren't just fighting for Edenview, they were fighting for the very concept of free will. Then we stopped them, he murmured, feeling the heavy weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. Whatever it takes. As the rain tapped steadily against the glass, Mark knew the path ahead would be dangerous and uncertain. But the truth was a weapon, and he was ready to wield it. The dim light of the emergency lamps flickered intermittently as I paced the narrow corridor outside the meeting room. My heart hammered in my chest, each beat echoing loud enough to drown out the distant hum of the failing power grid. I could still hear the faint murmurs of the resistance members gathering just beyond the heavy door. Their whispered conversations thick with suspicion and fear. But my focus was locked on one person, Alina. I had trusted her. More than anyone else in this fractured community, I believed she shared my vision of freedom from the invisible chains controlling Edenview. She was calm, collected, and always seemed to have a plan. But that trust shattered in a moment when I uncovered the encrypted messages she had been sending, secret communications with parties outside our circle. Who were they? What did she want? The questions churned in my mind, each answer more unsettling than the last. The door creaked open, and Alina stepped out, her usual composed expression holding a fragile veneer of calm. Her eyes met mine, steady but unreadable. "Mark," she said softly, "we need to talk." I motioned for her to step into the corridor, away from prying ears. The weight between us was palpable, thick with unspoken accusations and the ghosts of broken trust. "Why, Alina?" I demanded, my voice low but fierce. "Why were you sending those messages? Who were you working for?" She swallowed hard, her lips pressed into a thin line. "It's not what you think," she began, but I cut her off. "Then explain it. Because from where I stand, it looks like you've been playing a double game, selling us out while we risk everything." Her gaze flickered, a shadow crossing her features. "I never wanted to betray you," she said quietly. "But the puppet master, the one pulling the strings behind this nightmare, has leverage over me." My breath caught. The puppeteer was no longer an abstract enemy lurking in the background. Now, their reach felt personal and immediate. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, the hurt bleeding into my voice. Alina looked away, voice trembling, because I was afraid. Afraid for Jason, for you, for all of us. They threatened everything I love. At that moment, I became aware of a small figure watching us from the shadows at the end of the hall. My son, Jason. His wide eyes reflected the harsh glow of the emergency lights, and a flicker of fear crossed his face. I signaled for him to stay back, but the damage was done. The innocence in his gaze was a stark contrast to the betrayal unfolding before him. I turned back to Alina, my mind racing. Could I forgive her? Could our fragile alliance survive this fracture? Behind us, the whispered conversations among our allies grew louder, suspicion spreading like wildfire. Rico stepped forward, his jaw clenched, eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. "Is this true?" he demanded, voice rough with disbelief. Alina nodded, her confession spilling out in hurried fragments. She had been forced into covert cooperation, threatened with harm to her family if she disobeyed. Her actions, while damaging, had been a desperate attempt to protect those she cared about. The room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking deep. Trust, once broken, is hard to mend, and yet, in that moment, I realized that our fight wasn't just against external control, it was also against the shadows within ourselves. I took a deep breath, steadying the storm inside me. "We'll figure this out," I told her. "But from now on, no more secrets." Alina nodded, relief and resolve mingling in her eyes. As we stepped back into the meeting room, the fractured group eyed us warily. The night ahead promised challenges we had not yet faced. But if betrayal was a test, we had no choice but to pass it. Because survival in Edenview meant trusting, even when trust seemed impossible. "We move forward," I declared, voice firm. Together. Outside, the blackout stretched on, swallowing the gated community in a darkness that mirrored the uncertainty we all felt inside. But beneath that darkness flickered a fragile flame hope, fueled by the resilience of those who refused to be puppets any longer. The fight for Edenview was far from over, and this time I knew one thing for certain. The greatest threat was no longer just the unseen watchers, but the secrets we kept from each other. And with that, the night closed in, leaving us on the edge of an uncertain dawn. The first shrill wail of the siren tore through the stale air of Edenview's central hub, echoing off the concrete walls with a metallic shriek that set my nerves on edge. Jenna's fingers danced across the keyboard with frantic precision. Her eyes locked on the countdown timer, glowing in ominous red. 1237. 12 minutes and change until the final lockdown sequence would seal the gates of Edenview permanently. A digital coffin. "Mark, if we don't break through the firewall now, there won't be a way back. They'll lock this place down tighter than Fort Knox," Jenna whispered, voice taut with urgency. Her usually calm demeanor was cracked by anxiety. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. My son, Lucas, was somewhere out there, playing near the perimeter, blissfully unaware that our home was about to become a prison. The basement room was dim, illuminated only by the cold flicker of monitors and the faint hum of the backup generator struggling to keep the laptop alive. Outside, the sky was a surreal canvas of violet and electric pink, the vaporwave hues casting an eerie glow over the gated community's facades. It was beautiful and wrong at the same time, like a neon nightmare. "Mark, I think I've found a back door," Jenna breathed, her voice cracking as she bypassed layers of encryption. Suddenly, the screen flashed an alert. Security protocol engaged. The countdown accelerated. 0, 10, 21. Damn it, I cursed, pushing myself off the cracked concrete floor. There onto us. We had been fighting a losing battle since the blackout began, trying to wrest control of Edenview's smart infrastructure from the unseen puppet masters. It was clear now that this lockdown was the final act, a last-ditch effort to keep us trapped, to silence resistance forever. My heart pounded as I thought of Lucas. I had to get to him before the gates sealed shut. The thought of him locked inside with no way out was unbearable. I grabbed my flashlight and radio, signaling Jenna. "Cover me, I'm heading to the south gate." Outside, the world was transformed. The familiar streets were now ghostly corridors, lit only by the flickering street lamps, struggling against the blackout's shadow. I could hear distant voices, neighbors shouting, the frantic clatter of footsteps, the uneasy murmur of panic rippling through the community. Near the barricaded gates, Lucas laughed, chasing a small drone that hummed erratically in the thick air. His innocence was a stark contrast to the creeping dread I felt. I called out to him, my voice trembling with relief when he turned and smiled. "Daddy," he shouted, running toward me. I scooped him up as sirens wailed through the night, the sound slicing through the vaporwave haze like a knife. Suddenly, a shadow blocked the path. Harold, the community's security enforcer, stepped forward, the embodiment of the system we were fighting. His eyes were cold, his posture rigid, a uniformed sentinel of Edenview's collapsing order. "Mark," Harold said, voice low and threatening, "you don't belong out here. This lockdown is for everyone's safety." I squared my shoulders, feeling the weight of desperation and defiance collide inside me. "Safety? Locking us in is prison, Harold. We won't let you do this." He smirked, stepping aside just enough to let me pass, but not without a warning glance. The air was thick with tension, a storm ready to break. I moved swiftly, clutching Lucas's hand as we navigated the darkened streets. Overhead, the faint buzz of silent drones patrolling the skies reminded me we were never truly alone. The community's voices swelled, cries of fear, calls for help. Whispers of rebellion blending into a cacophony of human spirit, refusing to be extinguished. Back in the basement, Jenna's voice crackled over the radio. "I'm in, disabling the lockdown protocols now." But the system fought back. Alarms blared and defensive turrets near the control center activated. I heard shouts, neighbors running, the clash of resistance and authority spiraling toward chaos. I tightened my grip on Lucas, heart hammering in my chest. Time was running out. The race to save Edenview and ourselves had become a desperate sprint against an unforgiving clock. As we neared the gate, the red countdown was down to 0 to 15. Every second felt like a lifetime. Hope and fear tangled in the air like static. I glanced at Lucas, his wide eyes reflecting the flashing lights. "Hold on, buddy, we're not giving up." The gates began to hiss, the heavy metal doors inching downward. The final lockdown was imminent, and in that moment, I realized that Edenview's fate and our freedom depended on us breaking the script once and for all. The night air was thick with an unsettling quiet, punctuated only by the distant murmur of voices and the occasional sharp crack of shattered glass. I held Eli close, feeling the rapid beat of his small heart against my chest, a fragile reminder of everything I was fighting for. The blackout had stretched on longer than anyone dared hope, and now the walls of Edenview felt more like a cage than a home. In the dim, flickering light of our kitchen, every shadow seemed to loom larger, every silence heavier. Eli's wide eyes searched mine for reassurance I wasn't sure I could give. "Dad, will the lights come back soon?" he whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and hope. I swallowed the lump in my throat and forced a calm smile. "We're going to make sure they do, Eli. I promise." But promises felt brittle in a place where control was slipping through our fingers like smoke. The scripted behavior of our neighbors had fractured into chaos, and the enforcers, cold, unyielding, were tightening their grip. Lucas, the man who embodied that merciless order, had made it clear that they wanted me, and they would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. Earlier that evening, Jenna and I had met in hushed tones beneath the skeletal remains of what once was the community center's grand lobby. The room still smelled faintly of burnt circuits and stale fear. She had laid out the plan, while some of the group worked on disabling the remaining control nodes. I would draw the enforcers' attention away, sacrificing myself to give them the window they needed. "Mark, it's dangerous," Jenna had said, her eyes reflecting the wavering candlelight and a fierce determination. "But if anyone can do it, it's you. Eli needs you, but right now he needs you to be brave for all of us." I nodded, the weight of her words settling in my chest like a stone. I thought of Eli's face, the way his small hands clung to mine when the world felt uncertain. My heart ached, but there was no turning back now. The confrontation came with the first light of dawn. I stood at the community center's gate, the heavy metal cold against my palms, waiting. Lucas approached, flanked by two silent enforcers, his expression unreadable but his eyes sharp and unyielding. "Mark," Lucas said, his voice low and authoritative, "surrender yourself, and we can ensure your son's safety. Resist, and you risk everything." There was a pause. The world felt suspended in that moment. I looked past him, toward the shadows where Jenna and the others waited, ready to act once I was taken. The sacrifice was clear. The choice was mine. "I surrender," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. The enforcers moved swiftly, binding my hands with cold restraints that bit into my skin. Eli's small fingers brushed my cheek, his eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "Be careful, Dad," he whispered. A surge of fierce love and desperate hope flooded me. "I will," I promised. As they led me away, the first pale rays of sunlight spilled over Edenview's gates, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers reaching for freedom. In that fragile light, I held on to one truth, that sacrifice, however costly, was the spark that might ignite our salvation. But as the gates closed behind me, I couldn't shake the gnawing question, was this the beginning of our rescue, or the prelude to a deeper darkness? And in that uncertainty, the fight for Edenview's soul surged onward. The acrid scent of smoke filled the air, mingling with the harsh shouts and clattering of overturned furniture in the community center. Shadows flickered across the cracked walls as the last remnants of Edenview's fragile peace shattered in a violent crescendo. Mark's heart pounded fiercely in his chest, every sense tuned to the chaos swirling around him. His gaze locked with Marcus's, a man whose very presence seemed to harden the room into a battleground. "This ends now," Marcus growled, stepping forward, muscles coiled like a predator ready to strike. His scarred face twisted in a sneer, eyes blazing with the ruthless hunger for control. Around them, voices rose in anger and fear, neighbors divided into factions that once were friends. The community's collapse had become a war, fought not with armies but with fists, weapons, and desperate wills. Mark tightened his grip on Leela's small hand, feeling the tremble beneath his own. His son's wide eyes searched his face for assurance, for safety. He knelt down, voice low and steady despite the turmoil. "Stay close to me, kiddo. We'll get through this." Leela nodded, clutching his father's jacket with all the innocence and bravery a child could muster. The sound of a gunshot cracked through the air, sharp and terrifying, followed by a chorus of screams. The room erupted into chaos once more. Evelyn moved swiftly through the crowd, her sharp eyes scanning for threats. She confronted Derek, whose cold gaze betrayed no hesitation. "Put the gun down, Derek. This isn't the way," she urged, voice firm but pleading. Derek's hand hovered near his concealed weapon, his expression unreadable but charged with menace. For a tense moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The standoff broke with a sudden surge of movement. Fists flew, shouts turned to cries, and Mark found himself at the heart of the storm. His instincts screamed to protect Lila, to shield him from the violence consuming their home. Blood splattered across the floor as punches landed and bodies collided. The lines between friend and foe blurred in the desperation to survive. Amid the turmoil, Mark's mind raced. Every choice carried weight, every action a risk. Could he maintain his humanity in a place where order was a memory and trust a fleeting illusion? The collapse of Edenview's system had unleashed more than just darkness. It had exposed the raw, savage instinct beneath the surface. When the dust finally settled, the community center was a ruin of splintered wood and shattered glass. Mark stood bloodied but unbroken, the weight of exhaustion and determination etched on his face. Around him, neighbors nursed wounds, both physical and emotional, their eyes reflecting the hard truth. Edenview's old order was gone. Yet, in the midst of the destruction, a flicker of something else endured. A fierce resolve to fight back, to reclaim their lives from the shadows of control and chaos. Mark looked down at Lila, whose small hand still gripped his. In that moment, the future felt uncertain but no less hopeful. "We keep moving," Mark whispered, voice rough but unwavering. "No matter what comes next." Outside, the night stretched endlessly, but inside, a new battle had begun. One for the soul of Edenview, and for the fragile spark of freedom that still burned within its walls. The breaking point had arrived, and with it, the fight for survival, for control, and for the future of everyone trapped inside the gates. The echoes of violence faded into a heavy silence, broken only by the ragged breaths of those left standing, survivors who would face whatever came next, together or apart. Mark knew this was far from over, but for the first time in weeks, he felt a fierce glimmer of clarity. The script was broken. Now it was time to write their own story. As shadows deepened and the first hints of dawn touched the horizon, Mark's eyes burned with determination. Edenview's nightmare was far from finished, but so was their fight. And this time, they would not go quietly into the darkness. "Hold on," he murmured, voice barely audible but filled with promise. "We're just getting started." And somewhere deep inside, that was enough to keep going. The night air was thick with tension as we approached the central hub, the heart of Edenview's sinister control network. Shadowed by the faint glow of emergency lights, the building loomed like a silent sentinel, its dark windows reflecting the flickering remnants of a once brilliant digital world. Every step I took alongside Lena and Jared felt heavier, weighed down by the knowledge that if this assault failed, the nightmare we lived in would continue indefinitely. Eli clung to my side, his small hand wrapped tightly around mine. His wide eyes scanned the fortress-like structure, blending curiosity with a spark of bravery that belied his age. I could feel his pulse against my palm, steady but quickening. This was more than a mission. It was a fight for his future. Inside, the air was stale and cold, tinged with the metallic scent of machinery struggling against shutdown. The faint hum of power thrummed beneath the floorboards. a reminder that Edenview systems were still alive, still fighting back. Lena led the way, her portable terminal flickering as she connected to the hub's network. Her fingers danced over the keys with practiced urgency, each stroke a battle against the complex digital defenses designed to keep us out. "Almost there," she muttered, sweat beading on her brow. The emergency alarms began to wail intermittently, echoing down the sterile corridors. The red warning lights cast long, jittering shadows, making the walls seem alive with menace. Jared moved ahead, his imposing figure a shield against the unknown. When the automated defense drones swarmed out of the vents, their metallic bodies glinting ominously, Jared didn't hesitate. He met them head-on, his fists and makeshift weapons clashing with cold steel. The sounds of combat grunts, clangs, and the mechanical whir of drones filled the air, a chaotic symphony underscoring our desperate mission. From my position near the control core, I held Eli close, whispering reassurances I hoped he could believe. The core's screens flickered wildly, shifting from cold blue to urgent red warnings. Every second felt like a lifetime as Lena fought the last firewall, her voice strained but resolute. "Got it?" she finally exclaimed, the terminal emitting a sharp beep. The digital chains binding Edenview's residents began to unravel. The smart systems powering our captivity started to collapse, their grip loosening. Relief washed over me, but it was tempered by the knowledge that freedom meant uncertainty. The order we had known was gone, replaced by a raw, uncharted reality. As the hub powered down, the silence that followed was profound. A moment suspended between the end of control and the beginning of true autonomy. Eli looked up at me, hope shining in his eyes. "Dad, is it over?" I smiled, pulling him close. "It's just the beginning." Outside, Edenview's gates would soon open, but the real challenge lay ahead, rebuilding trust, reclaiming freedom, and facing whatever shadows remained. Tonight, we won the battle for control. Tomorrow, we'd fight for our future. The last firewall had fallen, but our story was far from over. The darkness was absolute. Mark sat on the edge of the couch, the only light in the room coming from a small candle flickering in the corner. Outside, the usual hum of the Edenview smart systems was gone, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to press in from all sides. His son, Eli, curled up beside him, clutching his worn stuffed rabbit, eyes wide but trusting. The blackout had deepened beyond anything Mark had feared. The entire community's systems had shut down. Not just the power, but every last node of control. Edenview was plunged into raw, unmediated darkness. Mark's mind raced as he tried to piece together the consequences. The gates were locked tight, the cameras offline, and even the emergency protocols had been rendered useless. The scripted behaviors that had gripped the neighborhood earlier now dissolved into confusion and panic. Without the smart infrastructure dictating movements and conversation, people were left to their own devices, and that was terrifying. He could hear distant voices, raised in fear or anger, but here in their home, the silence felt like a fragile cocoon. Eli shifted closer, his small hand gripping Mark's. "Dad, what's going to happen?" he whispered, voice trembling. Mark swallowed, searching for the words that would steady them both. "We'll get through this, Eli. We're still here, and we'll figure it out." Outside, the streetlights were dead, and the neon signs that once bathed the community in a vaporwave glow were darkened relics. Mark remembered the strange beauty of those lights, their pastel hues now replaced by the stark blackness of night. He had always trusted the systems, the invisible hands that managed Edenview's every detail. Now, it was just people, raw and unpredictable. Jenna appeared at the door, her face pale but resolute. "Mark, we need to talk. The others are gathering in the square. They don't know what to do." Mark nodded, standing up and grabbing a flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness as he stepped outside, Eli close behind. The streets were filled with silhouettes moving uncertainly, some clutching phones useless without signal, others staring blankly into the void. He spotted Derek, the community's unofficial enforcer, standing rigidly near the entrance to the central hub. His cold eyes scanned the crowd, a silent reminder of the order that had collapsed. Jenna approached Derek, her voice low but firm. "We can't keep living like this. The control is gone. We have to find a new way." Derek's jaw tightened. Without the systems, this place falls apart. People fall apart. Tension crackled between them like static electricity, the unspoken question hanging in the air: who would take control now? Mark moved through the crowd, sensing the raw human emotions bubbling beneath the surface: fear, anger, hope, and desperation. The blackout had stripped away the veneer of civilization Edenview had relied on, revealing something more primal and uncertain. He thought of Eli, of the future he wanted to protect. The boy's innocence was a beacon in the darkness, a reminder that beyond the systems and scripts, humanity endured. As the night deepened, the community struggled to find footing in this new world. Some sought to rebuild order, others to seize power, and a few simply to survive. Mark returned home, holding Eli close as the first faint colors of dawn began to bleed into the sky. The darkness was receding, but the challenges ahead were greater than ever. "We're not alone," Mark whispered, the promise hanging between them like a fragile lifeline. "We'll find a way." Outside, Edenview stood silent, caught in the uneasy balance between collapse and rebirth, a community forced to confront its true self in the darkness before the dawn. The sun dipped low, the sky bleeding into hues of violet and pink that stretched across the horizon like a fragile promise. Standing by the cracked fountain in the heart of Edenview, I let the silence settle around me, broken only by the distant hum of voices and the rustle of dry leaves skittering across cracked pavement. The fountain, once the gleaming centerpiece of this gated paradise, was now a skeleton of its former self, tiles broken, the water long gone, replaced by dust and the faint smell of earth reclaiming its territory. I knelt beside the edge, fingers tracing the jagged cracks, feeling the roughness beneath my skin. So much had been lost, not just the power or the control systems, but the very soul of this place. Edenview had promised us safety, order, a future bathed in convenience and technology. Instead, it had delivered us into a nightmare of surveillance and manipulation, a script we were forced to follow without knowing who was pulling the strings. Yet, as darkness crept over the community, I realized something else was stirring, a resilience that no blackout nor puppet master could extinguish. The neighbors I'd watched fall into trance-like routines were beginning to stir, their eyes clearing, their voices breaking free from rehearsed lines. It was fragile, uneven, but unmistakable, the first flickers of genuine humanity. My son Eli burst through my reverie, his small hands clutching a wildflower, its petals vibrant against the dull backdrop of broken concrete. His smile was a beacon in the dimming light, a reminder that innocence still thrived here. "Look, Dad," he said, holding the flower up like a treasure. "It's still alive." I smiled, the weight on my chest easing for a moment. "Yes, buddy," I said softly. "It is." Joanna and Raphael approached from the street, their faces lit by the flickering neon of a billboard that had somehow come back to life, casting vaporwave hues of pink and turquoise across their determined expressions. They were talking quietly, voices low but charged with purpose. I caught fragments of their conversation. Plans for rebuilding, organizing, protecting what was left. "Mark," Joanna called gently, "we're starting to pull people together. This can't be the end. Not like this." I nodded, feeling the stirrings of hope ripple through me. "It won't be. We have to make sure it isn't." Night settled fully, and above us, the first stars appeared, pinpricks of light against the velvet black. They reminded me that even in the deepest darkness, there was light waiting to break through. The echoes of Edenview's past its control, its surveillance would linger, but they would not define our future. As I looked out toward the horizon, I felt a quiet determination rise within me. This community, fractured but not broken, could rise again. We could rebuild Edenview not as a cage, but as a place of trust, resilience, and true connection. The path ahead would be hard, filled with uncertainty and scars. But for the first time since the blackout, I believed in the possibility of dawn. Eli tugged at my sleeve, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Dad, what's next?" I smiled down at him, squeezing his hand gently. "We build," I said simply. "Together." And with that, we stepped forward into the unknown, the faint glow of hope, our only guide in the lingering shadows. The air was heavy with the scent of fresh rain and something unfamiliar possibility. Edenview was waking up from a long nightmare, but the ghosts of control still lingered in every shadowed corner and silent street. The smart systems that once dictated every flicker of light and hum of energy were gone, dismantled piece by piece by hands that trembled with a mixture of fear and resolve. I stood in the community center, the meager light from a handful of battery-powered lanterns casting flickering shadows across the faces of my neighbors. Our eyes met in the dimness, searching for a spark of hope, a sign that this new chapter might not be as dark as the one before. "We're not just survivors," I told them, voice steady despite the knot in my stomach. "We're the architects of our future, but that future won't build itself." Rena stepped forward, her fingers brushing over the cold metal of a surveillance camera mounted crookedly on the wall. "It's time to make sure no one watches us anymore," she said softly, pulling the device loose and setting it aside. Around us, others began following suit, disconnecting the last remnants of the control system that had held us captive. The act was symbolic and practical, a declaration that Edenview would no longer be a prison. Outside, Eli darted through the streets, his childish laughter breaking the silence that had settled over our neighborhood for so long. He chased after a stray dog, his small feet padding over cracked pavement bathed in the neon glow of vaporwave skies. The colors seemed almost surreal, a pastel dreamscape that contrasted sharply with the grim reality we had endured. Watching him, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't dared feel in months' joy. But optimism was tempered by reality. Jared, standing near the unlocked gate that had once sealed us in, folded his arms and scanned the perimeter. "No systems, no control," he muttered. "That leaves us vulnerable. What if something worse comes along now?" His words struck a chord. The absence of surveillance meant freedom, yes, but also uncertainty. We were stepping into a new order with no blueprint, and every decision carried weighty consequences. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the community, I found myself caught between hope and apprehension. Inside the community center, neighbors formed small groups, voices low but earnest. Plans were sketched on scraps of paper, ideas for watch rotations, neighborhood patrols, and communication networks using old-fashioned radios. We were relearning how to be a community without the omnipresent eye of technology guiding us. I caught Rena's eye. "It won't be easy," she said quietly, "but it has to be done this way. If we don't reclaim control now, it'll be taken from us again." Her words resonated. Edenview's experiment in surveillance and control had failed, but our experiment in freedom was just beginning. I thought about Eli and all the children who deserved to grow up in a place where they could run freely without an unseen puppeteer pulling strings. The night deepened around us, and with it, the weight of responsibility. But beneath that weight was a seed. Fragile, uncertain, but alive. We were no longer prisoners of Edenview's systems. We were its keepers, its guardians, its new order. As I stood at the gate later, the quiet hum of distant city life beyond the walls was a reminder that the world continued outside our bubble, indifferent to our struggles. The darkness was no longer imposed. It was ours to navigate, and for the first time in a long time, I believed we could find our way into the light. "Tomorrow," I whispered to Eli, who had joined me, "we start building something better." He smiled, clutching his toy robot tightly. Together, and with that simple truth, the night no longer felt so dark. But even as hope blossomed, the question lingered: how do we guard our freedom when the threats lurking in the shadows no longer come from machines, but from within? The new order was fragile, and the future uncertain. Yet, it was ours to shape. And that was everything. The glow of the cracked laptop screen was the only light in the room, flickering weakly as the battery threatened to die. I leaned closer, squinting at the strings of encrypted code that scrolled endlessly across the display. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitant but compelled. Mara's warning echoed in my mind. The blackout was only the beginning. The control had mutated, hiding in the very devices we clung to for connection and safety. Outside, the usual hum of Edenview was gone, replaced by an eerie silence punctuated by distant sirens and the occasional bark of a dog. The gated community, once a symbol of security and modern convenience, was now a cage, its bars forged from invisible surveillance and psychological manipulation. Even though the power had returned to some, the true darkness remained. Mara had come over earlier that day, her eyes sharp with urgency. "Mark," she said, voice low, "you're not imagining things. Edenview's system didn't just shut down, it evolved. The cameras, the gates, those were just the surface. The real control lies in the devices everyone carries. Phones, tablets, even the smartwatches. They're all nodes in a network that watches us, listens to us, and shapes our behavior in ways we don't even realize." I had to see it for myself. So here I was, peeling back layers of digital smoke to find the source. The encrypted streams were cleverly disguised, buried deep in the firmware of everyday gadgets. What disturbed me most was the realization that this network was still active, silently transmitting data even after all we'd been through. Hours passed like minutes as I worked, the cold creeping into my bones and my mind racing with possibilities. Was this some last-ditch effort by whoever had orchestrated the blackout? Or was Edenview just one small node in a much larger web of control? The implications were terrifying. If surveillance was embedded so deeply, freedom might be nothing more than an illusion. Later, Mara and I met in the park, the sky above painted in surreal vaporwave hues of pink and teal. The neon glow cast long shadows over the empty benches and winding paths. We spoke in hushed tones, careful not to attract attention. "They're watching everything," Mara said, her breath visible in the crisp night air, every whisper, every movement. And they're using it to keep us in line, even when we think we're free. I nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle into my chest. But if they're always watching, why haven't they stopped us? Why the blackout? She shrugged, eyes fixed on the horizon. Control isn't just about stopping people. It's about shaping them, guiding them like puppets on strings. Sometimes the best way to control is to let people believe they have a choice. Back home, I watched Eli play with his toy robot, the small plastic figure moving clumsily across the floor. His innocent laughter was a stark contrast to the dark truths I was uncovering. I wanted to protect that innocence, to shield him from the creeping influence that had gripped our community. But how could I, when the very devices meant to keep him safe might be the chains binding him? A sudden flicker from the security monitor caught my eye. A shadowed figure appeared briefly, Agent Collins. His face was obscured, but his presence was unmistakable. The man who had represented the faceless authority behind Edenview's nightmare was still watching, still waiting. It was a chilling reminder that the fight wasn't over. The watch never sleeps. As dawn approached, I realized that reclaiming Edenview's freedom meant more than just restoring power or dismantling gates. It meant breaking free from the unseen eyes and silent whispers that had woven themselves into the fabric of our lives. The battle ahead would be harder than anything I'd faced so far. But for Eli, for all of us, it was a fight we had to win. The question lingered in my mind as the first rays of sun pierced the horizon. If the chains are invisible, how do you break them? And with that thought, the new day began, uncertain, fraught, but filled with fierce determination. The community center was alive with murmurs, the low hum of anxious voices weaving through the flickering light of emergency lanterns. The blackout might have lifted partially, but the shadows of what had transpired still clung tightly to Edenview's walls. Rows of folding chairs were hastily arranged, faces both familiar and strained gathered beneath the makeshift banners that bore the community's emblem, symbol now heavy with irony. I stood near the front, my son Ethan clutching my hand, his small fingers trembling slightly. He was quiet tonight, sensing the gravity even if he didn't fully understand. Leah, ever the calm mediator, moved among the neighbors, offering reassuring smiles as she distributed printed summaries of the proposed governance plan. The air was thick with anticipation and unease, a fragile cocktail of hope and fear. "Thank you all for coming," Leah's voice rang clear, cutting through the chatter. "We're here to decide the future of Edenview, not just how we rebuild, but who we become." I stepped forward, the weight of countless sleepless nights pressing down on my shoulders. The community had survived the blackout and the control experiment. But now the true challenge loomed, crafting a new order that would protect without imprisoning. "Friends," I began, voice steady despite the knot in my throat, what we faced was more than a power outage. It was a violation of our trust, our privacy, our very autonomy. The systems designed to keep us safe became chains that bound us. A hush fell. I clicked to the next slide, projecting the smart systems interface onto the cracked wall. Lines of code and surveillance protocols scrolled slowly, revealing hidden cameras, microphones, and control algorithms still embedded deep within Edenview's infrastructure. "These aren't relics of the past," I continued. "They're still here, watching, waiting. We must decide whether to keep them, modify them, or dismantle them entirely. But we cannot do so blindly or in fear. Transparency is our first step toward freedom." Councilmember Davis shifted in his seat, his skeptical gaze meeting mine. "Mark, security is paramount. Without controls, chaos could return. Have you forgotten what we endured? I haven't forgotten, I replied evenly, and neither have the rest of us. But security that sacrifices our freedom is no security at all. We need safeguards that respect our rights, not erode them. Leah raised her hands, calling for calm as murmurs grew louder. Let's remember, this is a debate about balance. We want safety, yes, but not at the cost of becoming prisoners in our own homes. During a brief recess, Ethan tugged my sleeve, his eyes wide and searching. He handed Leah a small drawing, a bright sun shining over a gate left open, with children playing freely beyond. Leah smiled softly, kneeling to accept it. This is what we're fighting for, I said quietly, looking down at my son. Freedom not just from darkness, but from fear. Back in the hall, voices rose and fell as neighbors voiced concerns and hopes. Rina, our tech expert, outlined proposals for community oversight committees and open-source monitoring tools. Slowly, tension gave way to cautious optimism. The final vote was called as the night deepened. Lanterns cast long shadows across the room, faces illuminated by flickering light and steely resolve. One by one, hands rose in favor of a new charter, one that promised transparency, community control, and respect for individual rights. As the last vote was counted, a collective breath was released. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't final, but it was ours. Ethan squeezed my hand again, a small smile breaking through the fatigue. We're going to be okay, Dad, he whispered. I nodded, feeling the fragile dawn of hope stir within me. Edenview's future was uncertain, but for the first time, it was a future we would shape together on our own terms. The road ahead would be long and fraught, but tonight, the lights of freedom burned brighter than ever. And as I looked round at my neighbors, I knew we had taken the first true step toward reclaiming our lives from the shadows. Outside, the faint hum of restored power whispered through the gates, a reminder that control was no longer imposed from above. It was now a responsibility shared by all. The price of freedom was high, but the cost of surrender was far greater, and Edenview was ready to pay it. But even as the meeting dispersed, a quiet unease settled in my chest. The Watchers might have lost this battle, but the war for our souls and our privacy was only just beginning. I glanced down at Ethan, his eyes closing as exhaustion claimed him, and I vowed silently to protect him from whatever darkness still lurked beyond the horizon. Freedom had a price, and we were only just beginning to understand its true cost. The night outside was still, but the future was anything but certain. And tomorrow, Edenview would wake to a new day and a new challenge. I took one last look around the emptying hall before stepping out into the cool air. The gates behind me stood open, not just physical barriers, but symbolic ones. And for the first time in a long while, I felt the faint stirrings of hope. The fight for Edenview was far from over. But tonight, we had reclaimed our voice, and that was everything. The night settled over Edenview with an uneasy quiet that felt more like a held breath than peace. Inside his small, still unfamiliar home, Mark sat hunched over his laptop, the soft hum of the device the only sound that accompanied him. The screen cast a pale, bluish light onto his lined face. Eyes narrowed in concentration as he sifted through the layers of restored system data. It had been weeks since the final power restoration, and yet the neighborhood still bore the scars of the blackout and the control experiment that had nearly broken them all. Mark's fingers danced across the keyboard, decoding encrypted logs that Jonas had helped him access. What they'd found was unsettling, a series of irregular data packets and system pings that suggested the presence of a hidden backdoor. Someone, or something, was still manipulating Edenview's smart systems remotely. The implications hit Mark like a cold wave. Their hard-won autonomy might be at risk once more. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaustion gnawing at the edges of his resolve. "Eli," he called softly, not wanting to disturb his son's sleep. No answer came, but he knew Eli was safe, probably wandering the quiet streets that still felt strange after so long confined indoors. Stepping outside, Mark felt the cool night air brush against his skin, the faint hum of distant generators mixing with the rustle of leaves. Down the street, he spotted Eli's small figure darting between shadows and pools of light cast by newly restored street lamps. Eli's laughter, light and unburdened, echoed faintly, a reminder of innocence amid the chaos. Mark watched him for a moment, a bittersweet smile touching his lips. This boy was his anchor, the reason he kept fighting, but peace remained fragile. Back inside, Mark's thoughts were disrupted by a sharp knock at the door. Carla stood there, her face tight with tension, eyes darting nervously. "We need to talk," she said, voice low but urgent. Inside the cramped living room, the air thickened with unspoken accusations. Carla's trust had frayed over the past weeks, her suspicion of the Resistance's methods growing alongside her fear. "Mark, you have to understand," she began. "There are things happening we don't control. People are acting strange again. It's like the blackout never really ended." Mark met her gaze steadily. "I'm aware, that's why I've been digging. There's a back door still open in the system. Someone's watching us." Carla's eyes widened. "Then what do we do? We can't fight shadows." Before Mark could answer, the door burst open and Jonas stumbled in, breathless and wide-eyed. "You need to see this," he gasped, holding out a tablet displaying real-time system alerts. "There's a new breach. Someone's trying to override the controls. If they succeed, Edenview could go dark again, but worse this time." The room fell silent, the weight of the revelation pressing down on them. Mark felt the familiar surge of determination, tempered by the knowledge that their fight was far from over. As the hours dragged on, plans were made and alliances tested. The aftershocks of the blackout rippled through Edenview, unearthing fears and fractures that threatened to undo everything they'd sacrificed for. Mark knew the road ahead was uncertain and perilous, but with Eli's laughter still ringing in his ears, he was ready to face whatever shadows lay ahead. Outside, the night deepened, the neon glow of distant city lights blurring into the horizon. Edenview was no longer just a community. It was a battleground for control, freedom, and the fragile hope of a new beginning. And Mark was at its heart, fighting not just for survival, but for the soul of the place he called home. The question hung heavy in the air: could they hold on to their freedom, or were the aftershocks of control destined to pull them back into darkness? The early morning air was crisp, carrying a fragile sense of calm that seemed almost foreign to Edenview's fractured streets. I stood just beyond the circle of tense faces, clutching Eli's small hand, feeling the unfamiliar warmth of hope flicker inside me. For weeks, the community had been a powder keg of suspicion and hostility, fractured by the collapse of order and the invisible script that had bound us in silence. But today, it was my son who held the key to something different: chance to heal. Eli, with his bright eyes and untainted spirit, had been watching the way neighbors eyed each other warily, how conversations turned to accusations, and how the shadows of Edenview's broken systems stretched long and dark over all of us. I had tried to protect him from the worst of it, but even a child could sense the tension that churned under the surface. This morning, as the sun began to spill pale light over the gated walls, Eli slipped from my side with quiet determination. He had gathered a small handful of wildflowers from the neglected patches of grass near the cracked sidewalk's simple, colorful blooms that seemed almost absurd amidst the decay. His small hands trembled slightly as he approached a group of neighbors locked in a heated exchange. "Here," Eli said softly, offering the flowers to a woman whose eyes were hard with fear and anger. "I picked these for you." The woman blinked, caught off guard by the child's innocence. The wildflowers were a stark contrast to the grim reality we'd all been living. She hesitated, then accepted them with a hesitant smile. The tension in the group shifted imperceptibly, a crack forming in the wall of mistrust. I stepped closer, heart pounding, as Eli moved from person to person, offering his small gifts. Each gesture was met with a flicker of surprise, a softening of expressions that had long been set in stone. It was as if his simple act of kindness reminded us all of who we were beneath the scars left by control and collapse. Jenna, one of the few neighbors who had dared to resist the scripted behaviors, caught my eye and nodded. Her eyes shone with renewed determination, a signal that maybe, just maybe, this fragile hope could grow. Suddenly, voices rose against two factions on the brink of confrontation, their anger bubbling dangerously close to violence. Eli, undeterred, stepped into the gap. His voice, clear and unfiltered by fear or suspicion, rang out. "Stop. We're neighbors. We're not enemies. We have to help each other." The crowd fell silent, stunned by the child's bravery. His words cut through the chaos like a beacon, reminding us of a truth we had almost forgotten. Slowly, the neighbors began to lower their fists, their gazes dropping from hostile to uncertain. Gavin, the community elder who had been skeptical of any hope, wiped his brow and took a step forward. "Perhaps it's time we listen," he murmured, his voice cracking with age and emotion. Encouraged, Eli took a deep breath and began leading a simple game, one we'd played in better days, encouraging laughter to ripple through the group. It was tentative at first, fragile like the dawn light, but it grew stronger. I looked down at my son, seeing not just the boy I'd been trying to protect, but a symbol of resilience and innocence in a world that had nearly lost both. In that moment, surrounded by neighbors beginning to reconnect, I dared to believe that even in Edenview's darkest hours, there was a light that could never be extinguished. But as the laughter echoed softly, I knew this was only the beginning. The road ahead was still fraught with danger and uncertainty, and the forces that had brought us here were not finished watching. Yet, for the first time in a long time, I felt something I hadn't dared to before: hope. And it was Eli's voice that had started it all. The night was far from over, but maybe, just maybe, the darkness was finally starting to lift. The hum of electricity surged back through Edenview's veins, like a slow, awakening pulse. It began subtly at first, a faint buzzing beneath the skin of the community, then blossomed into a chorus of clicks and whirs as lights flickered hesitantly to life. Mark stood on the porch of his home, the familiar yet now fragile glow of the street lamps casting long, tentative shadows across the cracked pavement. The darkness that had cloaked the neighborhood for weeks was finally retreating, replaced by the pale, flickering illumination of power restored. Ethan's small hand tightened around his father's, a silent anchor amid the swirl of emotions. The boy's eyes, wide and shining, reflected the streetlights like twin stars, a beacon of innocence in a world that had shifted beneath their feet. Mark could feel the weight of the moment, the relief, the exhaustion, the uncertainty, all mingling like the electric charge in the air. Neighbors began to emerge from their homes, blinking against the sudden brightness, faces haggard and lined with the toll of sleepless nights and unspoken fears, turned towards the light with a mixture of disbelief and cautious hope. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, a symphony of voices hesitantly reclaiming their place in the world. Mark recognized Leela's silhouette moving steadily through the gathering, her sharp eyes scanning the scene with a quiet determination. "It's really coming back," she said when she reached him, her voice low but steady. "The systems, the lights, everything. But it's not just the power we have to think about. It's what's left in the wake." Mark nodded, his gaze drifting to the darkened windows of some houses still shuttered in silence. The blackout had been more than a loss of electricity. It had been a fracture in the very fabric of Edenview's carefully controlled existence. Now, as the glow returned, so too did the memories of the strange, scripted behaviors, the whispered secrets, and the unseen eyes that had watched them all. Inside the community center, Mr. Cartwright stood by the window, his silver hair catching the light as he spoke with Lila. Their conversation was hushed but urgent, weaving through the challenges ahead, the repairs needed, the mistrust to heal, and the vigilance required to prevent another descent into chaos. Outside, a gentle rain began to fall, pattering softly against the pavement and washing away the dust and grime left by weeks of darkness. Mark watched the droplets trace patterns on the street, each one a tiny promise of renewal. The neighborhood was waking up, but the scars ran deep. As night deepened, Mark took Ethan's hand once more and led him to the gates. The heavy barriers that had held them captive now stood open, a threshold between the shadowed past and the uncertain future. Beyond lay the distant city lights, a glittering horizon of possibility and risk. "Do you want to see what's out there?" Mark asked, his voice a whisper against the night. Ethan nodded, stepping forward with the hesitant courage of a child stepping into a new world. Together, they crossed the threshold, leaving behind the dark cocoon of Edenview's blackout. The night air was cool and alive with the sounds of distant life. Cars humming on highways, dogs barking faintly, the murmur of human voices far away. For Mark, the return of power was more than a technical restoration. It was the rekindling of hope, the fragile first step toward reclaiming their lives. Yet beneath the surface, a quiet question lingered. How would they rebuild trust, community, and freedom after the shadows of control and surveillance had taken so much from them? The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, it was illuminated by the glow of possibility. As father and son walked into the night, the future of Edenview awaited a blank page, ready for the stories they would write together. But the light also revealed what had been hidden: fractures in relationships, unspoken fears, and the ever-watchful eyes that might yet linger in the corners of their world. The battle for Edenview's soul was far from over. Yet, for now, in this moment of fragile dawn, Mark allowed himself a breath of hope. "We're going to be okay," he whispered to Ethan, who looked up at him with a trust that was both a balm and a burden. And as the first true light of freedom touched their faces, they stepped forward into the light, into the unknown, into what would become their new reality. The gates closed softly behind them, but the story of Edenview was just beginning to unfold anew. The air in the underground chamber was thick with dust and the faint hum of emergency power. Mark's fingers trembled as he sifted through the brittle papers, each page revealing a fragment of a story darker and more complex than he had imagined. The yellowed documents were stamped with seals of agencies he had never heard of, bearing cryptic codes and disclaimers that seemed deliberately designed to obfuscate rather than inform. Jason sat quietly nearby, his small frame huddled under a threadbare blanket, eyes flickering between his father and the scattered documents. The silence between them was heavy but comforting, a fragile cocoon amid the storm of revelations that threatened to unravel everything Mark thought he knew. Alina paced nervously, occasionally glancing over Mark's shoulder, her expression a mixture of guilt and resolve. "This isn't just about Edenview," she whispered, voice barely audible over the faint static of the emergency lights. "It's part of a larger project, a social experiment designed to test control mechanisms on populations." Mark's mind raced, piecing together the puzzle. The blackout, the scripted behaviors, the surveillance, all orchestrated. But by whom? The documents hinted at a coalition between corporate interests and government agencies. A shadow network pulling strings from far beyond the gated community's walls. As he played the encrypted audio file, the crackling voice of the archivist emerged calm, clinical, almost dispassionate. Edenview represents a prototype in behavioral modulation and social compliance. The data collected will inform policies and technologies with applications at a national scale. Resistance is anticipated and accounted for. Mark's jaw clenched. The coldness of the message, the lack of empathy, sent a chill down his spine. This was no accident. It was a calculated move in a much larger game. Jason's soft hand on his shoulder broke through his spiraling thoughts. The boy's innocence was a stark contrast to the insidious forces they faced. Mark looked down at him, a surge of protectiveness and hope igniting within his chest. "We'll get through this," he promised quietly. Outside the reinforced window, the gates of Edenview remained shut tight, the darkened streets eerily silent. But now Mark understood that escaping the neighborhood was only part of the battle. The true fight was against an unseen puppeteer whose reach extended far beyond these walls. Determined, Mark gathered the documents, tucking the most critical files into his jacket. "We need to expose this," he said to Alina. "Not just for Edenview, but for everyone out there." She nodded, eyes steely with newfound resolve. "Then we better move fast. They won't let us unravel this without a fight." The weight of the legacy they had uncovered settled heavily on Mark's shoulders, but it also sharpened his focus. The collapse of Edenview's order was not the end, was only the beginning. And as the faint glow of dawn threatened the horizon, Mark steeled himself for the challenges ahead, knowing the shadows they faced were darker and more pervasive than ever imagined. But even in the depths of this revelation, a flicker of hope endured the unbreakable bond between a father and his son, a light that no darkness could extinguish. And so, beneath the looming threat of control and surveillance, Mark prepared to fight not just for freedom, but for the future itself. The clock on the kitchen wall blinked erratically before fading into silence, just as the last flicker of light died in the living room. I sat frozen in my chair, the soft glow of the tablet screen vanishing like a candle snuffed out. Ethan's small hand gripped mine tightly, his wide eyes searching my face for answers I didn't have. "Daddy," I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's okay, Ethan, probably just the power." But deep down, I knew this wasn't just any outage. Edenview was built on smart technology, integrated security, energy management, and communication systems that rarely, if ever, failed. This blackout felt different. It felt deliberate. I stood and moved towards the window, pulling back the curtain. The street was dark, the usual comforting glow of porch lights and street lamps extinguished. Neighbors were emerging from their houses, their movements synchronized in a way that sent chills down my spine. Mrs. Langford stepped onto her porch, her movements mechanical, her gaze fixed ahead without recognition. "Ethan, stay close," I whispered, guiding him away from the window. I fumbled for my phone, desperate for a signal or any sign of life beyond the darkened walls. The screen was dead, no bars, no messages, just a blank void. I tried again, rebooting, hoping for a miracle. A low murmur began to rise from the street, neighbors speaking in clipped, rehearsed tones that didn't quite fit the moment. It was as if they were following a script, their words and gestures devoid of genuine emotion. I stepped outside, the cool night air brushing against my skin, carrying a strange scentozone mixed with something metallic. The community I'd trusted for years was now a stage for something I couldn't yet understand. "Mark," a voice called softly. It was Mrs. Jennings from down the street, her eyes glassy as she repeated the same phrase over and over. "Everything is fine. Everything is fine." I clenched my fists, fighting a rising tide of fear. What had happened to Edenview? And, more importantly, who was pulling the strings in this sudden descent into darkness? I looked down at Ethan, his small face illuminated by the faint starlight, and made a silent vow. Whatever this was, I would protect him, no matter what. The night swallowed us whole, and Edenview's lights went out. Blackout begins. But for us, the real darkness was just starting. Outside, the community was eerily silent, except for the soft, syncopated footsteps of residents moving in unison. Their eyes glazed over, lips whispering indistinct phrases. The usual hum of machines, the chatter of neighbors, the barking of dogs, all had ceased. The power outage was total. I moved cautiously down the street. Every shadow seemed to watch me. The gates that normally swung open with a simple scan now stood motionless, locked tight. I pounded on the nearest security panel, getting no response. My breath formed small clouds in the chilly air as I realized our isolation was complete. A deep unease settled in my chest. This wasn't a simple technical failure, which something far more sinister. The community that promised safety through technology had become a cage, and we were trapped inside. I glanced at Ethan, who clung to my side, his small fingers cold in mine. His innocent question echoed in my mind. "Daddy, why is everyone acting so weird?" I had no answer. Not yet. And then, from the shadows, a faint flicker of movement caught my eye. Mrs. Langford stepping off her porch again, repeating her motion like a marionette on invisible strings. The script had begun. The blackout was more than an absence of light. It was the beginning of something darker, a loss of control that threatened to consume us all. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what lay ahead. This night in Edenview would change everything.